A very good morning to you. It's 7 o'clock on today's show. The Prime Minister says he's ready and willing to put troops in Ukraine as part of a peace deal.
Keir Starmer's decision to speak out comes as he heads to Paris today for an emergency summit.
It's Monday, February the 17th. Your headlines. Keir Starmer says that helping to guarantee the security of Ukraine keeps us all safe, and he's willing to back his words with British troops.
Yet, even as the Prime Minister talks about boots on the ground, he faces warnings that he'll have to impose new military cuts without an increase in defence spending.
Also ahead, family fears for the British bikers held prisoner by Iran. The Health Secretary says Labour has delivered 2 million extra NHS appointments in its first year. We'll speak to him shortly. Conclave and the Brutalists share the spoils at the 78th BAFTAs ceremony as Adrien Brody wins Best Actor. Conclave wins Best Film. A very good morning to you. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has said that the UK is ready and willing to put British troops on the ground in Ukraine to protect peace. He'll travel to Paris today for an emergency summit with European leaders. We'll get more from our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who's in Lviv in just a moment, and from Mari for the political analysis of what it all means for the budget. But first, here is Mari's summary report.
For 3 years, the war in Ukraine has pitched Russia against the West. Now, for the first time, the Prime Minister has explicitly said that he's prepared to deploy British peacekeepers in Ukraine. And he's expected to put pressure on European leaders to do the same at today's emergency summit in Paris. The Prime Minister said the UK has already committed £3 billion a year until at least 2030. But it also means being ready and willing to contribute to security guarantees in Ukraine by putting our own troops on the ground if necessary. I do not say that lightly. I feel very deeply the responsibility that comes with potentially putting British servicemen and women in harm's way.
If we're talking about giving up a significant amount of Ukrainian territories and then having our allies, our friends, patrolling them as if they were neutral territories, that only means settling in and accepting the fact that international law has been breached, and we have all swallowed this fact, basically, and have given the okay for aggression.
Today's meeting in Paris was called by the French president after it emerged that European leaders had not been invited to peace talks between America and Russia, which could start as early as tomorrow, and strong hints that US support could be scaled back.
I think he wants to stop fighting. I see that. We spoke long and hard. Steve Witkoff was with him for a very extended period, like about 3 hours. I think he wants to stop fighting. They have a big, powerful machine. You understand that.
Britain and France have always seen themselves as America's closest allies in Europe. But after days of chaotic briefing by the White House, both are now pushing back against Washington, insisting that peace talks must include Ukraine and its security must be guaranteed. Exactly what a European-led peace force would look like remains unclear, but the Prime Minister insists that standing by Ukraine is also to guarantee the future of Europe and ultimately our own safety.
Well, as mentioned, our security and defence editor Deborah Haynes joining us now from Lviv in Ukraine. Deborah, just how significant a step is it to hear the UK Prime Minister say he's considering boots on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, it's a hugely significant moment. It's a reflection of the evolution of the fighting and the fact that the UK and France and other allies have been talking about what next if Ukraine isn't allowed immediately to become a member of NATO. How can they possibly try to deter future attacks? And clearly the answer they've come up with is boots on the ground.
In terms of how it's gone down there, Deborah, what's been the reaction?
Well, I mean, here in Ukraine, people are desperate, of course, for an end to the fighting, but of the continuation of American support. The Ukrainian president has repeatedly said that any kind of international peacekeeping force or security force needs to have a US element, or else it's just not going to be credible. It won't deter Russia. And to give a sense of the scale of the undertaking this will be for countries like the UK, Volodymyr Zelensky, that he's said he's got a map drawn up where he could see 110,000 foreign soldiers deployed along his border. The UK would struggle to maintain a deployment of just a few, of just several thousand troops for any meaningful length of time. So the big question is, who else is going to be involved in this? How are they going to sustain it? Do they have the weapons to be able to deter Russia? Right now, it's unclear that they do have any of these things, frankly.
So, Deborah, you talk about the scale of what would be needed. So, I mean, what kind of a boost to defence spending are we talking about here in order to actually have enough boots on the ground from the UK?
Well, if finances and the constraints on the Treasury were not an object, then, of course, defence spending would need to accelerate immediately. People that I speak to talk about it needing to push up to at least 3% of national income, possibly higher, 3.5%. Just to give you a sense of what that means in terms of money, right now the UK spends about 2.3% of GDP on its defences. The Prime Minister has said he will lift that at some as yet unstated point to 2.5%. That would be an increase of about £5 billion a year. That would, if it were to happen immediately, it would stave off the need for instant cuts this year of the military, and everybody knows how bad that would look, given that you've got Donald Trump saying very clearly to his European partners, and they are still partners for now, that they need to step up, they need to be much stronger, they need to take on a greater responsibility for European security. And among those partners, the UK, obviously, it views itself as one of the strongest military in Europe. So the spectacle of the UK cutting its defences at a time when the threat is so high and the warnings from the US so stark, I mean, that's really hard to contemplate. But the only answer, therefore, is increased money now. Hit that 2.5% target now, sources say, and then maybe increase further over time. If you don't do that, the UK will have to cut its defences, and that will look incredibly weak.
Deborah, just finally, I mean, the timing, I'm sure, was no accident from the Prime Minister to make this announcement about boots on the ground en route to Paris to meet his European counterparts. You know, one issue here, of course, is the US. The other one is fellow European leaders. How big a task does the Prime Minister have if his aim is to convince the rest of Europe to join him on being willing to put boots on the ground in Europe?
It's a huge task. The French have been very clear that they want to be involved in this. The UK and France have worked together closely on military operations before. You'll remember that they were the two countries that were the first to sort of start, the tram going past, they were the first to start bombing in Libya in support of rebels who were trying to oust Muammar Gaddafi back in 2011. But those two countries together combined, they just don't have the might anymore to be able to deter Russia from attacking again. They will need other countries. I spoke to the Dutch Prime Minister at a security conference in Munich over the weekend. He indicated that his country is willing to be involved. Others, like Poland too, would probably be forward-leaning. But unless, and this is fundamental, unless the US as well supports in some way, maybe not boots on the ground, but maybe supplying jets to be able to patrol the skies, warships to be able to attack from the sea, then it's just very hard to see how the Europeans alone can provide the security force that Ukraine needs to be able to ensure that Russia will be too scared, too intimidated to try to strike again.
Deborah, great stuff as always. Thanks so much, Deborah Haynes in Lviv. And Mari, just to wrap up the conversation, how easy is it for the Prime Minister even to go from 2.3 to 2.5%? Is it an impossible task without spending cuts or tax increases?
I think without spending cuts or tax increases, there would be a position where Rachel Reeves would be considering or worrying about breaking her fiscal rules, which she has said are non-negotiable. So realistically, if she is going to, first of all, have to potentially cut spending already in the next few months because of what we've heard from the OBR forecast potentially coming out, not looking as good as we were expecting, growth forecasts, etc. If she then needs to want to find, an extra 5, 10, 15, 20 billion, depending on how much more they want to increase defence spending by, if that is the case, that is a lot of money that is going to have to come from somewhere. So either they are going to have to cut perhaps things like, I don't know, welfare. We keep talking about the ballooning welfare bill. The DWP budget is ever increasing, and we have politician after politician saying, for instance, that we can kind of sustainably afford to pay the level that we are right now. There's always talk about, whether we can still afford things like the triple lock. There are lots of things. We don't know what would be on the table. Or, as you say, the other option is to increase taxes. The difficulty is, with a manifesto pledge not to raise taxes on working people, that leaves you with a very small amount of taxes that you can hike. Some would argue they then go in the opposite direction in terms of boosting growth.
One wonders, of course, had you not done the NIC increase already, would now be the time to breach the manifesto more broadly, with a sort of wildcard national security explanation as the reason for it. Anyway, Mari, we're going to discuss that with the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, in about 5 minutes' time. For now, Mari, thank you. That's at 7:15. And at 7:30, we'll be joined by the former United States National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. Great to have him with us today. Of course, he was Trump's NSA in 2017 and 2018. A great time to have him here in studio at 7:30. Now, a British couple who've been detained as they rode across Iran on a motorcycle trip have been named by their families as Craig and Lindsay Foreman. The couple have been accused of security-related offences. Well, Matthew Thompson's here with this story. Matthew, just give us the background of this. More news has come out this week, but they've been detained for a while.
Yes, exactly. So we actually think they crossed into Iran on the 30th of December. The two are a couple in their 50s. They're on a motorcycle journey across the world, effectively, and they entered, we think, Iran from Armenia on the 30th of December, but it's only now that the state-backed Iranian media has essentially announced that they've been charged with security-related offences, but that's a bit nebulous. We don't quite know what the specifics of it are yet. On their Instagram, as you can see, they've been documenting their journey. On the 3rd of January, actually, they wrote, to put your minds at rest, we're having the most amazing time in Iran. And clearly only days after posting that, they've been detained. They did say that they've been aware of the risks, but they said in a post that the rewards of meeting incredible people and seeing the breathtaking landscapes outweighed their fear. Now, of course, the Foreign Office advises against all but essential travel to Iran, and it actually warns in its sort of document on Iran that even just having a British passport can be a pretext for arrest. And quite often we know the Iranian regime will try and use it as a bargaining chip to get some concession or other from the British government. And we have a statement from the couple's family who said, this unexpected turn of events has caused significant concern for our entire family. We're deeply focused on ensuring their safety and well-being during this trying time. We're actively engaging with the British government and relevant authorities. And then, of course, anytime someone is detained in Iran, it brings to mind previous instances. Of course, I'm thinking in particular of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who spent 6 years in Iranian detention. And her husband, Richard Ratcliffe, has spoken out and said that basically the British government needs to act much quicker than it did to help this couple than it did in his wife's case. And actually, he says that the Foreign Office travel advice should be updated to reflect the fact that hostage-taking, as he calls it, is a fairly regular occurrence. And it doesn't necessarily matter if you've travelled there, in his words, with a good heart, you can still get embroiled in international pawns and become a pawn in the Iranian game, essentially.
Matthew, thanks so much. Matthew Thompson. Let's have a look now at some of the other stories making headlines this morning. Well, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Tel Aviv and backed Israel's war aims in Gaza, saying Hamas must be eradicated.
Related to that, the president's been very clear. Hamas cannot continue as a military or government force. And frankly, as long as it stands as a force that can govern or as a force that can administer or as a force that can threaten by use of violence, peace becomes impossible. They must be eliminated. They must be eradicated.
At least 9 people have been killed as storms sweep across part of the United States. The weather has mainly impacted southeastern states, with 8 people dead in Kentucky and 1 in Georgia. Meteorologists say this bout of weather is the 10th and coldest polar vortex of this season. Police are still searching for the suspect behind the fatal Valentine's Day shooting at a Kent pub. A woman in her 40s was shot at the Three Horseshoes in Knockholt near Sevenoaks just after 7 p.m. and was pronounced dead at the scene. Police believe that the perpetrator may have entered the River Thames. Singer Shakira has been taken to hospital, forcing her to cancel one of her concerts in Peru. The singer posted on Instagram saying she'd been suffering from an abdominal issue. It was honours even at the BAFTAs as frontrunners Conclave and The Brutalist both picked up 4 gongs each. Conclave picked up Best Film. Adrien Brody picked up Best Actor for The Brutalist. Our arts and entertainment correspondent Katie Spencer rounds up the action.
Unexpected from the off, David Tennant's Proclaimers sing-along, a uniting moment at a ceremony where BAFTA voters seemed split by this year's bewildering array of choice. Brady Corbet, director of The Brutalist, which walked away with 4, summing up the general mood.
Best director, I mean, there's no such thing as best. I'm in a category with Denis Villeneuve, for Christ's sakes.
The post-war epic's lead, Adrien Brody, full of praise for his co-stars.
This is for our collaborative efforts.
A double win for the return of Wallace and Gromit.
I didn't actually write a second speech.
The Aardman animation equaling the number of wins as musical Emilia Perez, Zoe Saldana winning for the Spanish language film, but the actor joking she's yet to master speaking like a Brit.
Films are supposed to change hearts and just challenge minds, and I hope that Emilia Perez did something like this. Please, okay, because voices need to be heard, just not my English accent. Bye, guys.
The audience on their feet for this year's fellowship recipient, Warwick Davis, thanking those who have supported him after the death of his wife.
Thank you for showing me that life can still have meaning and for helping me to laugh and to love again.
Beating Demi Moore for Best Actress, star of Anora, Mikey Madison winning for her role as a stripper, referencing in her speech the sex worker community.
You deserve respect and human decency. I will always be a friend and an ally.
But the film Conclave was blessed with winning the night's big prize.
Audiences around the world went to see the movie and championed it. Thanks to you, we owe you a lot.
Divine intervention from the British Academy, or perhaps the obvious outcome as the papal thriller had led the nominations. Either way, it's an award season with no shortage of plot twists. Katie Spencer, Sky News.
Turning back to politics, exclusive polling conducted by YouGov for Sky News has laid bare the challenge the Conservatives face from Reform UK. When it comes to trust, strength and clarity of purpose, Kemi Badenoch's Conservatives are now trailing Nigel Farage's party. Sky's Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates has this analysis for us.
Just how much trouble are the Conservatives in? How much potential does Reform UK have? Sky News has new exclusive polling allowing us to take a deep dive. Right, start here. Back 10 years ago, when Nigel Farage led UKIP, remember that? People thought that he was just too toxic to ever become Prime Minister, that there might be a ceiling on his and UKIP support that's lower than the potential pool of Tory voters. But how has that picture changed now he's leading the new party, Reform UK? And there's a clever way to measure all of this, so follow me on this. This bar here is the UK electorate. Now, we asked how many people would definitely not vote for Reform, and 56% said that they would definitely not. And here's the thing, that's an almost identical figure to the 55% who said they would definitely not vote Tory. Now, what does that mean? That means that the potential pool of 44% of voters could vote Reform. It's almost the same as the 45% who could vote for the Tories. So it really doesn't seem from all of this that Reform UK have a ceiling any higher or lower than the Tories. Now, I want to compare and contrast a few specifics when putting the Tories side by side with Reform UK. Now, how do voters feel about the two-party brands? Well, look at this. Only 10% see Kemi Badenoch's Tories as strong. 61% view them as weak. But what about for reform? Look at this. 31% see them as strong, more than the 27% that see them as weak. Let's do another one. Now look at this. Only 18% of voters say that they think the Conservatives have a clear sense of purpose under Kemi Badenoch, whereas 59% say they are unclear about what the Tories actually stand for. And now let's put that side by side with reform. And 49% say there's a clear sense of purpose from Nigel Farage Reform UK, whereas 24% say they're unclear about what that party stands for. And do voters trust either of the parties? Not very much. It's certainly a resounding no for the Conservatives. 11% say they're trustworthy, 65% untrustworthy. But when it comes to Reform UK, 19% trustworthy, 52% untrustworthy. Now, it's too early in this Parliament for parties to have much policy. We're judging and seeing voters judging them on vibe. But at the moment, almost every element of the vibe of Reform UK is more attractive to voters than Kemi Badenoch's Conservatives. Challenging times ahead for the Tories.
And more on that on Sam's podcast, of course, as usual. Now, the Prime Minister says he's prepared to put troops on the ground in Ukraine in a peace deal, if a peace deal is reached. Sir Keir Starmer's in Paris today for an emergency meeting with European leaders. I'm delighted to say I'm now joined by the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, to get the government's take on all of this and shortening waiting lists as well, which we'll come to. Good morning, Health Secretary.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us. The Prime Minister's willing to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. Were you surprised to hear him say that?
No, I think we recognise that the front line in Ukraine isn't just a matter for the Ukrainians, it's the front line for the whole of Europe, including Britain's national security. What the Ukrainian people have been confronting is the imperial expansionist ambitions of President Putin, which are also a threat to wider European security and Britain's national security. We know that the US presidential election and the inauguration of President Trump has brought a new momentum now to the focus on ending the war in Ukraine. And I think what the Prime Minister is setting out today and the case he'll be making with European leaders today, as well as in Washington with President Trump next week, is that as well as securing an end to this war, we have to secure a lasting peace and the security of Europe, including Britain's national security. And he's willing to commit, if necessary, British troops to a peacekeeping force to secure our own national security, Ukraine's security and European security at large.
Most people's analysis and a lot of the reporting over the weekend, suggests this would need a boost to our defence spending. Specifically, that would, but more broadly, the new scenario and era that we're in. When you see talk of a need for a boost to defence spending, when you know how tight the public finances are, does it make you concerned that it will mean cuts to your budget that you have at health? Is that a reality that all cabinet ministers are going to have to contend with?
Well, to be honest, we came into government with a commitment to get our defence spending up to 2.5% of GDP. And frankly, for the last 7 months, all of us in government, not just the Prime Minister and Chancellor, all of us in government have been contending with the dire state of the public finances and the choices that imposes on us. It's why we've had to be honest, field some brickbats across a whole series of interviews about what we can and can't afford to do at the moment. But there is no greater priority for any government or any government worthy of the name than the security of the nation. And as I say, the Prime Minister feels this very strongly too. The war in Ukraine isn't just the front line for the Ukrainians, it's the front line for all of us on our continent and across our continent, because we know where President Putin's imperialist expansionist agenda takes him. It takes him to threaten Britain's own national security, which is why we've got to stand together as a NATO alliance, and that's the case that the Prime Minister is making.
What I think I'm hearing you say, Health Secretary, is that if, and it's a big if still, it's not definitive, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor say to you, look, we pledged this extra funding, we're going to have to dial it back for the issue of national security, that would be something that you understand. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. I guess to take it a step further, is this national security and things outside of our control that have emerged since the election? Is this sufficient a reason to break a manifesto pledge, if necessary?
Well, we're committed to delivering our manifesto. In fact, today I've been able to announce we've delivered our first step on cutting NHS waiting lists, for example.
We'll have the whole second half of the interview on that in 1 minute. But, things change. National security, as you're outlining, is the priority. If necessary, should taxes go up, some of the taxes that were, understandably at the time, manifesto pledge, because it's needed because of new events and national security?
Look, we don't treat our manifesto lightly. We made all of those commitments in good faith, and we are determined to carry them out and to deliver every single one of them in the same good faith. That's the work all of us are committed to doing. We don't pretend that the choices we face are easy, but we didn't ask to come into government for an easy ride. We came into government because we knew the challenges were enormous. We knew the scale of change that was needed in our country, and people have trusted us to deliver that change. And that's what we're doing. It's why sometimes we've had to make some unpopular decisions in the last 7 months, but we've made those unpopular decisions because we believe they're the right decisions to get Britain out of the massive hole it was left in. And we have to do that at the same time as confronting the challenges we see in the world. And if anything, that's reflected with what you're hearing from the government today, which is a Prime Minister who is simultaneously announcing that we've delivered our first step on the NHS, 2 million more appointments in the first year, delivered 7 months earlier than planned. We will smash that target by July, at the same time as he's also going to Paris to meet with European leaders about our defence and security before heading to Washington next week. Whether it's the domestic agenda, whether it's the international agenda, this is a Prime Minister and a government that's facing up to the challenges facing our country rather than trying to duck them as some of our predecessors have done.
So tell me about this milestone that you're saying you've hit early within your department.
So we promised to deliver 2 million more appointments a year to cut NHS waiting lists as our first step. And we've delivered that 7 months early. So from the period of July to November, we delivered 2 million more appointments than the Conservatives did for the same period the previous year. And by July, people will be able to compare the first year of a Labour government, first full year, with the last year of Conservative government. And there's a number of reasons why we've been able to do that, not least ending the strikes so that we've got doctors on the front line, not on the picket line. But there's, of course, before anyone thinks we're getting complacent, still enormous challenges in the NHS, a hell of a lot more to do on waiting lists, on A&E response times and ambulance response times, on people's ability to get a GP appointment, which aren't covered in today's figures. So I don't pretend there aren't still enormous challenges. I'm not doing victory laps, but I think it's important when people are so cynical about, frankly, politics, politicians, and whether any of us can deliver anything we say, that we are reporting back to the country saying, we said we'd deliver 2 million more appointments in the first year. We've delivered early. A lot done, a hell of a lot more to do.
You're also announcing that you're going to give extra funding to the NHS trusts that are delivering the best results. That makes sense. At the same time, does it mean the underperforming trusts spiral lower still?
Well, it's one of a range of measures we're putting in place. I mean, I find with the NHS, you've got to have the right incentives and the right penalties. So with those underperforming trusts, we are putting in place measures to support them to improve their performance. And frankly, where it's down to bad leadership, we will manage out poor leadership. But we've got that right combination, I think, set out in the reform plan the Prime Minister and I published at the beginning of January, of both the incentives to go faster, but also the penalties for poor performance as well.
Just finally, Health Secretary, I wanted to bring back to the meeting that the Prime Minister's having in Paris today. Of course, it comes at a point where the rhetoric, very clearly from the US towards Europe, has changed. Is there actually an opportunity here, particularly in light of the EU renegotiation that's going on as well in the background, for the UK and Europe as a whole to come together in a practical way? I'm not saying rejoin the EU. I'm just saying, can both sides, for the first time perhaps in a long time, see that it's just worth being sensible on negotiations rather than competing?
Well, I think there's a common acceptance across the whole continent that when it comes to defence and security, our prospects are intertwined. And, if you think about what safeguarded Britain's defence and security since the Second World War, it has been the NATO alliance, as well as really important bilateral relationships. The bilateral relationship we have with the United States, essential for Britain's security. The bilateral relationship with France in particular, essential for European security. So when it comes to defence and security, we're stronger together. When it comes to broader relationship with the EU, we are determined to work through some of the practical obstacles that are getting in the way of things like trade or cooperation on science and research in a level-headed and pragmatic way. We're not going to relitigate past referenda, but what we can do is build a stronger future as the closest of friends with our European neighbours.
Wes Streeting, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break here on The Breakfast Show. When we come back, is America still a reliable ally for Ukraine or for the UK? We'll speak to HR McMaster. That's next.
Once almost lost, these denizens of the deep are back.
The problem for these whales is global warming. Water temperatures are rising.
We're worried that the animals are actually starting to starve.
Deadly and outdated. What do you think should happen to the nets?
I would like to see them go.
I'm Nicole Johnston, Sky's Asia correspondent, based here in Beijing.
A towering monument to the China dream and its demise.
From one end of this country to the other, China is littered with real estate that's falling apart.
China is facing a tsunami of the elderly.
We have to work as long as health allows, otherwise, no money.
China is under pressure to pay for the pensions of 500 million retirees. I've reported on a wide range of stories from around the world.
Mass protests forced the president to flee.
The sight of the president's private swimming pool only reinforces to Sri Lankans the great divide here between rich and poor.
Aid groups say Gaza is now the world's most dangerous place to be a child.
The Israeli army has raided towns and villages all over the West Bank. These tunnels run all over Gaza. The Gaza Strip is ridden with them.
A referendum designed to unite the country has only deepened its divide.
Sydney's floodplains underwater again. This is the third or fourth time in 18 months that their homes have gone under. Sky News, the full story first. It may seem like a gimmicky toy, but it is part of the global race between the United States and China for new technology. This elite engineering designed to humour and to help us.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests.
Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free, wherever you get your news.
The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Welcome back. Beginning of a huge week for diplomacy. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, heads to Paris today for an emergency summit on Ukraine, and he says he's prepared to put British troops on the ground as part of a peace deal. The European leaders are not represented at peace talks between the US and Russia, which could start as early as tomorrow in Riyadh. Joining me now is the former US National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. A very good morning to you, General. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, good morning, Wolf. Great to be with you.
Big picture question to start with. And, of course, you were President Trump's National Security Advisor, 2017 to 2018. I think you agree with some of the big overarching aims that he tries to tackle. But equally, you didn't last that long in this administration because you disagree with some tactics. So I'm interested on how you view Trump Mark II and some of the rhetoric, some of the actions of the last month or so, and whether ultimately you think there's good intentions or has it gone too far?
Well, I think there are good intentions, and there are certain things, Wolf, that President Trump is very consistent on, right? Burden sharing in defense, reciprocity in trade, for example, border security, deregulation, and setting conditions for economic growth. I mean, these are all very consistent themes with him. Where he carries a certain dissonance with him, or two opposing ideas, is oftentimes in the areas of national security and defense. So you'll hear him often say peace through strength, but then at the same time, you'll also see him have this sort of drive towards some kind of an entente or a deal, in this case as applied to Ukraine, which I think can be a bit dangerous because you want to go in to any sort of negotiation, which is about to happen in Saudi Arabia, from a position of strength, and Vladimir Putin, I think, has some hope a little bit here that he'll be able to manipulate Donald Trump into an agreement that favors Russia.
Do you think that the US has given up too much before the negotiations have started? Specifically no NATO membership for Ukraine?
Well, I think it's unwise to take anything off the table. So maybe these will be put back on the table. Who knows? But I think what was behind a lot of this, these seemingly concessions up front, is this misunderstanding of the nature of the war, that Russia actually has aspirations in mind in Ukraine that go far beyond anything in relation to us or what we do. I mean, what Russia really wants to do is to completely subjugate Ukraine as the first step in really shifting the balance in Europe in favor of Russia and, importantly, in favor of this axis of aggressors, which includes another revanchist power on the Eurasian landmass, China, as well as Iran in the Middle East. And I think it's really important for President Trump at this stage to see these connections and also to recognize he's coming in from a position of tremendous strength because there are real frailties in within this axis of aggressors.
Do you think that ship has sailed, though? When you look at the rhetoric from so many of the Trump appointees and Trump himself, when it comes to Russia, and specifically Russia and Ukraine, do you think he'll ever think, gosh, this could be a World War II type moment, that may be a step too far? Is it possible for Keir Starmer, when he meets him in Washington, to convince him to change track, or are we now working within this new set of rules, this new set of parameters?
No, there's a great deal of flexibility there with Donald Trump. What you get with Donald Trump is you get, complete transparency. Oftentimes, as you've seen in the last couple of weeks, you hear him think out loud about a lot of the situations he's confronting internationally, and the war in Ukraine and the aggression of the axis of aggressors. I mean, but I think the more he has these conversations, he learns conversationally and will revise his assessment. I think it's important to remember from 2017 to 2018, and I write about this extensively, Trump put more sanctions on Russian entities and individuals than in the previous 8 years of the Obama administration. And I tell the story of laying out for President Trump on a chart acts of Russian aggression that followed really incidents or decisions that portrayed weakness to Putin. And the point that I was making to him is that, hey, what provokes Putin is the perception of weakness. And that's when he agreed to provide Javelin missiles and other defensive capabilities to the Ukrainians for the first time. So I think the more conversations he has with European leaders, with Prime Minister Starmer, the better.
And your book, At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House, is freshly out of a new version for the UK. And it's got some amusing anecdotes as well of working in the White House, as well as the important ones you mentioned. Let's touch on the headline today here, which is Keir Starmer announcing en route to Paris that he's willing to put troops on the ground in Ukraine, obviously post a peace deal. How significant is that in the eyes of the White House, do you think?
I think it's very significant. And I think what is really important here is how much there's been continuity in the British position here across now two governments, and that bipartisan support for Ukraine has been significant because it's really been the UK that has pushed ahead in support for Ukraine. I think one of the reasons we're in the position we're in is the degree to which the Biden administration meted out assistance to Ukraine and tried to manage the conflict. When, in fact, if they had been able to just give everything that Ukraine needed up front, then I don't think we'd maybe even be in this position because Russia is taking unsustainable losses already. And it was the UK that provided some of the new lethal capabilities early and push the United States to do the same.
I'm interested in your take on where European defence spending is. I mean, the UK is at 2.3%. Some are expecting the Prime Minister to announce 2.5 quicker than otherwise. Is 2.5 irrelevant now, or is it a bit rich of the US to sort of change the nature of what the pledge should be? I mean, things do change, but it's in light of where our finances are in this country, it's pretty hard to get to much more than that anytime soon.
I think what's important just to remember in general is, hey, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to prevent a war than to have to fight one. And I think what's more important than the 2.5 or 2.65 debate that I read about going on here in the UK is what kind of force do you want to have? And what you need is you need a military force that can operate for sufficient duration and an ample scale to prevail in a conflict, hopefully as part of an alliance like within NATO. And that's really what is at stake. I think what's happened is we have traded off for way too many years now capacity in our armed forces for what we believe were going to be more and more exquisite capabilities that would guarantee our security. Well, hey, guess what? We've seen our enemies, potential enemies, adversaries, develop countermeasures to those capabilities.
Do you think the UK would be capable of having a genuine peacekeeping force in Ukraine based on the current state of our military?
Well, I don't not the UK on its own, I don't think, because of the size of the armed forces. Now, you have a tremendously capable, professional force, that I would want to pick first to fight alongside within an alliance or a coalition. But it's just the question of scale, the depth in the armed forces.
Can Europe do it on its own, or does the US have to be involved? And when, again, going back to all the rhetoric we see from President Trump and his new advisors and team to say that they're not going to be a part of anything like that, is that a bluff to get us to spend more, or is it a legitimate threat that worries you?
Well, it worries me because so much of our infrastructure, our logistics, it's all integrated within NATO. And that's what allows us to burden share. And this is, again, one of these elements of dissonance with President Trump. He wants more burden sharing, but at times he can be skeptical of the alliances that actually make that burden sharing feasible and possible. I think, though, what he would want to do is take credit for some increases in defense spending because he's cajoling everyone into it. And, of course, what's important to remember is he's not the first U.S. president to make this case. I mean, this has been across multiple administrations. And the American people in particular, I mean, they have a sense, many of them have a sense, that Europe has been free riding on the largesse of American taxpayers. And that's a real sentiment in the United States. President Trump didn't create that. He kind of more reflects that, I think. And it's important, I think, for all of us to recognize it's a very dangerous period. Heck, North Korean troops are fighting alongside Russians in the first major land war in Europe since World War II.
What's the message of all of this to China? Because on one level, you're maybe saying that we'll boost NATO in the long term and Europe will boost its defences in the long term. But in the short term, you're sort of pulling a little bit back from NATO whilst sort of appeasing, potentially, at least from some of the rhetoric so far, someone for incursion into foreign territory. Is this a green light to China to take Taiwan? I mean, how are they interpreting it?
Well, it really depends on how these negotiations pan out. Are we going to let Russia offload the cost of this war, the $1 trillion of damage they've done to us and everybody else, or are they going to have to take responsibility for the damage that they've created? Will Ukraine's sovereignty really be protected against what we know what will be a sustained campaign of subversion, even after a ceasefire? Remember the failure of the Minsk agreement in 2015. Let's not replicate that. And I think China's watching this very closely, as you're alluding, because they think that if Russia can succeed here, maybe they can succeed in laying claim to the ocean in the South China Sea or to Taiwan, for example.
I have a final question, which is, I guess here in Europe, sometimes people look at this and they think, how can President Trump's rhetoric be so strong and anti-China and then slightly different towards Putin and Russia? Is there something more to his relationship with Putin specifically, or is it just his tactics? What does that come down to?
I think it's really this old idea that it's not good to have really two revanchist powers allied with each other on the Eurasian landmass. And there's nostalgia, I think, for policies and foreign policies of the 1970s to try to divide Beijing and Moscow. But I think you can't do that these days because of the nature of the strategic partnership, the partnership with no limits, right, between Putin and Xi Jinping. I think what is the tremendous opportunity now is to glue them together, also with the Iranians, all of whom have really big economic and financial difficulties facing them. And I think now is an opportunity to press our advantage. Russia and China keep saying, we're seeing changes such that have never happened in a century. And what they're really trying to do is to replace the old order, the old rules of international discourse, and replace them with a new set of rules that's sympathetic to their authoritarian form of government. And in China's case, it's mercantilist statist economic model. President Trump really has an opportunity at this stage to make us tired of winning, as he would like to say. But he has to do it from a position of strength, and he has to do it in close coordination with our allies in the UK, in Europe, Japan. And we are really in a position of relative strength. And I hope he takes advantage of the opportunity, Wolf.
General, it's always a pleasure to catch up, but particularly here in person. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
It's wonderful to be with you. Thanks.
General H.R. McMaster, whose new book, At War with Ourselves, is out now. Thanks so much. Let's bring in our security defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who's live in Lviv for us this morning. Deborah, what did you make of some of what the General was telling us there?
Well, he made just the fundamental point, really, didn't he, when it comes to the whole question of defence spending, that it's cheaper to prevent a war than it is to fight one. And that really is the dilemma that is facing political leaders across Western Europe. It's a continent that hasn't had to think about existential war since the end of the Cold War, and in that period has shifted priorities from spending money on maintaining large, credible armed forces at the capacity to fight an enduring war to nicer things like healthcare, social welfare, building the economy. And it's also a state of mind. It's a mindset amongst publics, amongst populations, and understanding that if you genuinely believe there is an existential threat to your country, then you need to be willing to make sacrifices, not just in how you are spending taxpayer money, but also how you are willing to use your people to defend your country and to build up national resilience. That's something that the UK, that France, that Western Germany, that countries across Europe during the Cold War understood fundamentally, because they were the children of those who fought in 2 world wars. But that is a collective knowledge and a national lexicon that has faded over the last decades and is now going to have to be revived if Western leaders are going to be able to achieve what they've been setting out over the last few days in Munich, at a defence ministerial, in NATO, this recognition that as the US steps back, they are going to have to step forward and defend Europe and have a decision on the future of Europe rather than being dictated by the whims of stronger powers.
Deborah, as always, thanks so much. Deborah Haynes for us in Lviv, Ukraine for us this morning. We'll be back with Deborah next hour. Still to come here on The Breakfast Show, I'll be speaking to a former Iranian hostage about the British couple who have been detained in Iran. We'll be right back.
We're going to do this 100 times every day for the next 3 months.
Why have we agreed to this?
Raises many questions about many things.
Actually seeing people impacted, she was so upset.
It was powerful. They kind of couldn't believe they were being berated here.
Very much on my terms, I think was the subtext. News happens fast around Donald Trump.
It was a kind of wow moment.
Yeah, that's what it feels like, doesn't it?
It's Trump world, and we just live in it.
So, where next?
Follow Trump 100 wherever you get your podcasts. I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. Do you fear a 4th indictment? Does your government owe an apology to the British home children?
Great to see you.
Does your government owe them an apology? The fact that they were intercepted, does that indicate a military weakness on the part of Iran?
No, no, no.
Free, wherever you get your news. There's no doubting the strength of this hurricane as it roars through. You can feel a devastating power. It had been a difficult night in a deadly storm.
Bang, bang. You can hear it hitting the windows.
Our houses are okay.
It's depressing.
As bad as all of this is, it could have been much worse. Today, this land they call sacred is at the heart of America's electric car revolution.
To me, it's a sacred ground.
The white gold rush is a race that Biden doesn't want to lose. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world. Donald Trump, 45th President of the United States, it would appear is about to learn his fate.
Escort coming out!
San Quentin houses America's largest death row. They rarely allow cameras onto the condemned block.
James Matthews, Sky News. I want to be treated equally like everyone else.
It's one step closer to getting out, to getting off death row.
Sky News. Get the full story first. Mr. Trump, James Matthews from Sky News.
Hey, James.
You're diminished by claims that you're a racist.
Question?
Mr. Musk, has your ignorance and ego cost Ukrainian lives? Vladimir Putin calls you outstanding. What do you call him, sir?
He's from Sky News. He's from Sky News. He's entitled to ask me questions.
Mandatory evacuation. You must leave.
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's chief North of England correspondent.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Sky News, the full story first.
Welcome back. The family of a British couple who've been detained in Iran say they are significantly concerned about the situation. Craig and Lindsay Foreman are understood to have been held by Tehran while travelling across the globe on a motorbike trip. Iranian state media reported that a man and woman were in custody in Iran's southeastern city of Kerman on security-related charges. Well, join me now is the former Iranian hostage and a founding member of the Alliance Against State Hostage Taking, Anna Diamond. Thanks so much for joining me, Anna. What is your reaction to hearing that this couple not only have been detained, but on security-related charges?
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. Well, my initial reaction was really just of disappointment. You know, as we know, Iran's isolationist approach in politics and economy has meant that they have had to resort to using innocent dual and foreign nationals as windows for negotiations with the West, which makes them a leverage for them. And unfortunately, Craig and Lindsay are the latest victims of this hostage diplomacy. Iranians in the IRGC, I want to point out, have been doing this for over 4 decades. Their so-called revolutionary tactics began in 1979 when the revolution took place, and pretty much immediately after the Iranian Islamists took, if the audience may remember, over 50 American diplomats hostage for over 400 days. So this is unfortunately not new news, essentially. And they basically never changed their tactics. It's just that we didn't remember that they used to do hostage diplomacy until the last decade when things ramped up. And when I was taken hostage in 2014, there were already 15 known dual and foreign national cases in Iran, hostages that had been taken alongside me. So my real disappointment in all of this is that after 40 years, I would have hoped that the Western governments would have come up with a viable policy to counter Iran's hostage diplomacy. However, we kind of keep giving into it or being forced into it. And it's just sad to see that another lovely couple has become a victim of all of this.
There's a lot there, and it's so fascinating to hear your take more than anybody's as a former hostage. And maybe I'll get to in a moment what might be going through their minds at the moment. But just to pick up on what you just said, are you suggesting that we shouldn't now negotiate with the Iranian regime as hostage takers, that it sets a precedent? Is that the point you're making?
I mean, of course, when your nationals are being held captive on trumped-up charges, you have to negotiate. You have to try to get them out. Otherwise, what does being a British citizen really mean if you can just be taken wherever whoever wants to harm you? However, I do think that constantly, and this is not just something that the UK is still figuring out how to do. You know, we've seen it with Germany, we've seen it with the US. We recently saw it with Italy, with the journalist Cecilia Sala, who was taken hostage in Iran because her case was linked with that of Mohammed Najaf Abadi, who was arrested in Italy on a US warrant because he was supplying Iran with drone components, which is illegal. Iran is under sanctions. So, you know, you have to negotiate. But at the end of the day, if you constantly give in to their demands, it's just going to become a pattern, and it has become a pattern at this point. So what I am saying is that there should be a policy where we can say, you know, you can't do this anymore. Now, of course, I know it's easier said than done, but it has been going on for too long, with too many innocent people spending years of their lives in prison. I was there for 4 years. As we know, Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe was there for over 6 years. I hope this couple will be different. I hope they'll come out way sooner than that. But at this point, it's just like a broken record, really.
If we have about not long left, but just given your experience in 30 seconds, if possible, what do you think will be going through their minds right now?
I mean, they must be terrified. Their families are terrified. I want to emphasize here that Hostage International, which is a charity, helps the families of hostages, and they've been pivotal in my recovery after coming back to the UK. But I just hope that the UK government will help them and that they won't feel alone in prison, because really knowing that there is someone or a team of people helping you and rooting for you outside prison is sometimes all it takes to give you hope. So I hope that will happen here.
Anna Diamond, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We're going to take a quick break here on Sky News Breakfast. When we come back at the top of the hour, I have all of the day's top stories as the Prime Minister travels to Paris for crucial talks with European leaders. We'll be right back.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
A very good morning to you. It's 8 o'clock. On today's show, the Prime Minister says he's ready and willing to put troops in Ukraine as part of a peace deal.
Sir Keir Starmer's decision to speak out comes as he heads to Paris today for an emergency summit.
It's Monday, February the 17th. Your headlines. Sir Keir Starmer says that putting troops in Ukraine helps guarantee security for the whole of Europe. And the government tell this programme Britain needs to set the tone for all.
The front line in Ukraine isn't just a matter for the Ukrainians, it's the front line for the whole of Europe, including Britain's national security.
Yet despite his talk about boots on the ground, the Prime Minister faces a reality check with warnings he'll have to cut the military if he doesn't increase defence spending.
Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, lands in Saudi Arabia for talks this week with Russian officials aimed at ending the war in Ukraine.
Also ahead, family fears for the British bikers held prisoner by Iran. And Conclave and the Brutalist share the spoils at the 78th BAFTAs ceremony as Adrien Brody wins Best Actor. A very good morning to you. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has said that the UK is ready and willing to put British troops on the ground in Ukraine to protect peace. He'll travel to Paris today for an emergency summit with European leaders. In a moment, we'll speak to our international correspondent, Diana Magnay, ahead of negotiations in the Middle East, and our political correspondent, Mara Aurora, about what this all means for domestic politics. But first, our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who's in Lviv for us. Deborah, how significant an announcement is this by the Prime Minister, and how's it going down there in Ukraine?
It's a hugely significant announcement. You'll know, of course, that the UK and other allies have been very clear that they don't want to send boots on the ground in Ukraine since Russia's full-scale war almost 3 years ago now. But for the last year or so, there have been private conversations going on, increasingly becoming public, about what next. What can Ukraine's allies do to help support this country in the event of some kind of negotiated settlement? The US has made clear that Ukraine will not immediately be a member of NATO. So one rung down from that is NATO boots on the ground to try to deter Russia from attacking again. And here in this country, of course, they want an end to the war, but they want to make sure that Russia is deterred from fighting again and not just given respite to rearm and re-attack.
Deborah Haynes for us live in Ukraine this morning as the Prime Minister, of course, travels to Paris to discuss exactly that. Let's now go to Diana Magnay in Jerusalem. The other big diplomatic discussion of the week will be taking place nearby in Riyadh. What can we expect, Diana?
Well, Marco Rubio, in an interesting interview with the American network CBS yesterday, said that everybody should recognise that this is very, very early stages, but that you have to start the process somewhere. He's been very cagey about who he's actually going to be meeting in Saudi Arabia from the Russian side. It's not entirely clear whether he'll be meeting with Sergei Lavrov, who he did have his first telephone conversation with on Saturday night. But we do expect talks to begin on Tuesday in Riyadh with Russian officials of some sort to get the ball rolling, really, on a possible process to start talks on peace, because Donald Trump said that he felt that a summit could be held in Riyadh between Vladimir Putin and himself in the coming weeks. So Marco Rubio really laying the groundwork for that. But certainly the Russians haven't said that Sergei Lavrov is going to be coming. We shall have to see. And this was a trip that was scheduled in advance. Marco Rubio announced it about a week and a half ago that he was going to go to Saudi Arabia because he will also be talking to the Saudi Crown Prince about the peace process in Gaza. Donald Trump's proposals for a Mideast Riviera. Rubio was here in Israel meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday. So that will also be part of the process. But we really are seeing the Middle East playing a very significant role geopolitically now in fighting a number of fires in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine. And adding to that, Volodymyr Zelensky landing in the United Arab Emirates also last night, we think, to negotiate further prisoner exchanges, which the Qataris, Saudis and the UAE have been instrumental in securing in the past between Russia and Ukraine.
Diana, thanks so much for that. And we should say as well, Marco Rubio expected to touch down in Riyadh in the next 20 minutes or so, so we'll keep an eye out for that. Well, Mari is still here because we're going to discuss all of the implications for the UK government of all of this. But first, we spoke to the former US National Security Advisor to Donald Trump during his first term, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, about Sir Keir Starmer's willingness to commit British troops to Ukraine.
I think it's very significant. And I think what is really important here is how much there's been continuity in the British position here across now two governments, and that bipartisan support for Ukraine has been significant because it's really been the UK that has pushed ahead in support for Ukraine. I think one of the reasons we're in the position we're in is the degree to which the Biden administration meted out assistance to Ukraine and tried to manage the conflict. When, in fact, if they had been able to just give everything that Ukraine needed up front, then I don't think we'd maybe even be in this position because Russia is taking unsustainable losses already. And it was the UK that provided some of the new lethal capabilities early and pushed the United States to do the same.
I'm interested in your take on where European defence spending is. I mean, the UK is at 2.3%. Some are expecting the Prime Minister to announce 2.5 quicker than otherwise. Is 2.5 irrelevant now, or is it a bit rich of the US to sort of change the nature of what the pledge should be? I mean, things do change, but it's in light of where our finances are in this country, it's pretty hard to get to much more than that anytime soon.
I think what's important just to remember in general is, hey, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to prevent a war than to have to fight one. And I think what's more important than the 2.5 or 2.65 debate that I read about going on here in the UK is what kind of force do you want to have? And what you need is you need a military force that can operate for sufficient duration and an ample scale to prevail in a conflict, hopefully as part of an alliance like within NATO. And that's really what is at stake. I think what's happened is we have traded off for way too many years now capacity in our armed forces for what we believe were going to be more and more exquisite capabilities that would guarantee our security. Well, hey, guess what? We've seen our enemies, potential enemies, adversaries, develop countermeasures to those capabilities.
Do you think the UK would be capable of having a genuine peacekeeping force in Ukraine based on the current state of our military?
Well, I don't not the UK on its own, I don't think, because of the size of the armed forces. Now, you have a tremendously capable, professional force, that I would want to pick first to fight alongside within an alliance or a coalition. But it's just the question of scale, the depth in the armed forces.
Can Europe do it on its own, or does the US have to be involved? And when, again, going back to all the rhetoric we see from President Trump and his new advisors and team to say that they're not going to be a part of anything like that, is that a bluff to get us to spend more, or is it a legitimate threat that worries you?
Well, it worries me because so much of our infrastructure, our logistics, it's all integrated within NATO. And that's what allows us to burden share. And this is, again, one of these elements of dissonance with President Trump. He wants more burden sharing, but at times he can be skeptical of the alliances that actually make that burden sharing feasible and possible. I think, though, what he would want to do is take credit for some increases in defense spending because he's cajoling everyone into it. And, of course, what's important to remember is he's not the first U.S. president to make this case. I mean, this has been across multiple administrations. And the American people in particular, I mean, they have a sense, many of them have a sense, that Europe has been free riding on the largesse of American taxpayers. And that's a real sentiment in the United States. President Trump didn't create that. He kind of more reflects that, I think. And it's important, I think, for all of us to recognize it's a very dangerous period. Heck, North Korean troops are fighting alongside Russians in the first major land war in Europe since World War II.
Our political correspondent, Mario Aurora, is here to discuss this topic in more detail. Mario, there's a sort of balance here of a massive headache for the Prime Minister and the government. If we're going to have to spend more, Not just the headache, by the way, on the front lines, but if we're going to have to spend more, how is it going to be funded? At the same time, is there an opportunity for the Prime Minister to show leadership, as I think the op-ed has started to do, as he might do in this summit in Paris? And this is a bit, I guess, facetious on this, but have some cover to make some changes to the budget.
I think you're right. I think when you look at, for instance, how the UK has led on Ukraine since Russia's invasion, you can see that actually we have been at the forefront of that when it comes to our European partners. Remember back to when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister and how at the front of everything he was right at the beginning of that invasion, really taking leadership, and it therefore was something he was remembered for, something he was associated with. And the same could be said about Keir Starmer right now when it comes to the amount of diplomatic efforts that are going into making sure that Starmer is right in the heart of some of these discussions, as he will be today in Paris and next week in Washington, but also being that kind of ally, that kind of liaison point, as it were, between Europe and the US. So I do think there is an opportunity, politically speaking, for Keir Starmer. The difficulty will be, as you rightly say, if we are going to increase defence spending, where's the cash going to come from? Now, we know we've had Labour saying 2.5%, 2.5%. We still don't know when that's going to be. When the election campaign was happening, the Tories said they would do it by 2030. Labour would not commit to that. So the difficulty will be not only when will we get to that 2.5%, but also, excuse me, if military chiefs are saying and stressing that they need to go further, how will we get there?
We can listen to what the government told us this morning when Wes Streeting was with us.
The front line in Ukraine isn't just a matter for the Ukrainians, it's the front line for the whole of Europe, including Britain's national security. What the Ukrainian people have been confronting is the imperial expansionist ambitions of President Putin, which are also a threat to wider European security and Britain's national security. We know that the US presidential election and the inauguration of President Trump has brought a new momentum now to the focus on ending the war in Ukraine. And I think what the Prime Minister is setting out today and the case he'll be making with European leaders today, as well as in Washington with President Trump next week, is that as well as securing an end to this war, we have to secure a lasting peace and the security of Europe, including Britain's national security. And he's willing to commit, if necessary, British troops to a peacekeeping force to secure our own national security, Ukraine's security and European security at large.
So you can see from the Health Secretary there what he is trying to explain and justify in terms of Keir Starmer's decision-making and thought process. I think what's most important now is the detail. What kind of peacekeeping force will this look like? What kind of numbers of troops are we talking about? Not just on a European scale, but specifically to the UK. How many British servicemen and women could potentially be deployed onto the ground in Ukraine? Those kinds of details we really need to find out, because that will also give us more of a hint of how much this potentially could cost us.
Just quickly, it came at a day where he had quite a big announcement to make.
Yes.
Overshadowed, though.
Yeah.
Overshadowed the summit. The government couldn't decide when it was. Maybe they couldn't decide when the Prime Minister needed to put his op-ed on, but perhaps they could have delayed their NHS announcement because it was a big announcement.
Yeah, it would have been wise. So actually a really big achievement for the Labour government. They've had these extra 2 million appointments. They've achieved this much earlier than they pledged they would in the election campaign. So it's actually something to shout about. But nonetheless, as you say, the timing of the announcement means that evidently it is overshadowed by what we're talking about in terms of our role in Ukraine.
Mark, great stuff as always. Thanks so much. Let's take a look at some of the other big stories making headlines this morning. At least 9 people have been killed as storms sweep across parts of the United States. The weather's mainly impacted southeastern states, with 8 people dead in Kentucky and 1 in Georgia. Meteorologists say this bout of weather is the 10th and coldest polar vortex of the season. Police are still searching for the suspect behind the fatal Valentine's Day shooting at a Kent pub. A woman in her 40s was shot at the Three Horseshoes in Knockholt near Sevenoaks just after 7 p.m. and was pronounced dead at the scene. Police believe that the perpetrator may have entered the River Thames. Singer Shakira has been taken to hospital, forcing her to cancel one of her concerts in Peru. The singer posted on Instagram saying she'd been suffering from an abdominal issue. British cyclist Geraint Thomas has confirmed via his X account that he'll be retiring at the end of this season. In his 19-year career, he's won the Tour de France in 2018, is a double Olympic track cycling champion and received an OBE in 2019. The Welshman does say that he still has some big races to prep for this season. It was honours even at the BAFTAs as frontrunners Conclave and The Brutalists each picked up 4 awards. Conclave picked up Best Film, while Adrien Brody picked up his first BAFTA statuette for Best Actor in The Brutalist. Arts and entertainment correspondent Katie Spencer rounds up the action for us.
Unexpected from the off, David Tennant's Proclaimers sing-along, a uniting moment at a ceremony where BAFTA voters seemed split by this year's bewildering array of choice. Brady Corbet, director of The Brutalist, which walked away with 4, summing up the general mood.
Best director, I mean, there's no such thing as best. I'm in a category with Denis Villeneuve, for Christ's sakes.
The post-war epic's lead, Adrien Brody, full of praise for his co-stars.
This is for our collaborative efforts.
A double win for the return of Wallace and Gromit.
I didn't actually write a second speech.
The Aardman animation equaling the number of wins as musical Emilia Perez, Zoe Saldana winning for the Spanish language film, but the actor joking she's yet to master speaking like a Brit.
Films are supposed to change hearts and just challenge minds, and I hope that Emilia Perez did something like this. Please, okay, because voices need to be heard, just not my English accent. Bye, guys.
The audience on their feet for this year's fellowship recipient, Warwick Davis, thanking those who have supported him after the death of his wife.
Thank you for showing me that life can still have meaning and for helping me to laugh and to love again.
Beating Demi Moore for Best Actress, star of Anora, Mikey Madison winning for her role as a stripper, referencing in her speech the sex worker community.
You deserve respect and human decency. I will always be a friend and an ally.
But the film Conclave was blessed with winning the night's big prize.
Audiences around the world went to see the movie and championed it. Thanks to you, we owe you a lot.
Divine intervention from the British Academy, or perhaps the obvious outcome as the papal thriller had led the nominations. Either way, it's an award season with no shortage of plot twists. Katie Spencer, Sky News.
Let's get more now on our lead story. The Prime Minister has said he's ready and willing to deploy British troops to Ukraine as part of peacekeeping forces. The Shadow National Security Minister, Alicia Kearns, joins me now to discuss this. Thanks so much for joining us on this topic. Do you support the government in this regard?
Well, I'm quite cautious because we're not at a place in which we understand the terms or the conditions or the numbers or the way in which we've been deploying our people. And we should always make sure that we are making decisions based on as much information as possible. The reality is that Ukraine is still fighting for its freedom. Russia has taken around 600 square miles of territory over the last few months. We're not in a place as yet where I think we can be making those commitments. But in terms of standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, we've demonstrated we will do that time and time again, and we will give them what we need. But I just think we're not in that place as yet. Things are going to change over the next few hours, let alone the next few days, weeks and months.
But I mean, if you read the Prime Minister's op-ed, he's not professing that all of the terms are agreed, and he is hypothetically pledging his support for boots on the ground on behalf of the UK as part of a peacekeeping force. Is that something the Conservatives wouldn't do?
And look, we've, as I've said, given more support to Ukraine than any other country. But I'm used to seeing what it's like out where we have people deployed. I don't like to deal in hypotheticals when it comes to putting our men and women on the ground fighting for people, because I've seen how dangerous it can be on the ground and how important those decisions are. So what I'm saying is, yes, we will always give Ukraine the support they need. We will stand shoulder to shoulder with them. We will fight for them to determine the terms of this peace. And also, it's important to note, this can't just be, well, we've managed to stop the shooting and murder, and therefore we've got peace. We need a peace peace deal that will end the threat to our European neighbours and to us, one that will make us safer from the state that is currently behaving like a terrorist. That's what we need to know. So I'm saying we need to be cautious, we need to know exactly what the terms are, and at this place, it is too early to say we will absolutely deploy peacekeepers, because for all we know, a deal could be done that says that Ukraine loses more territory, and we could be defending territory that essentially enables Russia's narrative that they had every right to launch this appalling renewed illegal invasion. We have to make sure we know the terms we're signing up to.
To be clear, that is essentially what the Prime Minister's op-ed said. He's not saying absolutely he will deploy boots on the ground. It's a hypothetical offering.
That is the announcement
you mentioned,
today.
Sorry?
But that is what he's wanted to lead the country with today, saying that he will provide peacekeepers if necessary. We will do what is necessary, but I think there is timing. It's a bit like the discussion about Saudi Arabia. We hope this is a sequencing. First a meeting with the Russians, separately then a meeting with the Ukrainians, then we move forward. But there are points at which you make timings for these sorts of announcements, and his priority should be today talking about defence spending, so that if he is planning to move to peacekeepers, we have been able to invest in land, because currently the focus has been on air and sea, because that's what keeps our country safe, that he puts in place a defence spending now that should have been happening since July.
I mean, you're trying to criticise the state of defence spending 6 months into their government when this is a long-term issue after 14 years in power.
I've always been very clear I was critical of my own government, but the reality is that 2.3% of defence is what we've been spending. That is a good amount, and we've been investing in the right equipment. We made sure that we were able to give Ukraine what it needed, when it needed, whether it was Challenger 2 tanks or long-range missiles. But what I'm saying is since July, a decision was made to side with the Treasury to not give the increase in defence spending we needed to continue to replenish stocks. Replenishing stocks should be the priority so that we are ready if we do need to provide peacekeeping services, if we do need to provide more support to Ukraine. So look, I will continue to stand with Ukraine, but I will also speak out, as I have done since the moment I was elected, to make sure that we defend our security.
Let's touch on this gathering in Riyadh. In fact, Marco Rubio's plane has just touched down. We might see him stepping off it whilst we're talking. Are you critical of the US for proceeding as they are?
I'm very cautious about anything that doesn't see Ukraine determine what peace looks like and that doesn't make clear that Ukraine must be victorious in its situation. They were the ones that were illegally invaded again. However, I also understand from diplomacy, having been involved in things like the Syria peace talks, that there is a chronology and there is a sequencing. I would be very cautious about trusting anything Putin says. We have a history over the last 20 years, in fact, if not longer, of trusting what Putin says and underestimating the Ukrainians. We cannot repeat that pattern again. So there is a point in diplomacy where you sit down with the two sides separately and then you move forward from there. But as I would say, they should be very, very cautious when it comes to Putin and make sure they don't repeat the lessons of the past.
Just whilst we've still got you, we're waiting Marco Rubio to step off his plane any moment now. Is he someone, as when you were chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, or in your current role or past role, have you dealt with him in the past? Do you think he's good news for the United Kingdom, or have you been concerned by some of his rhetoric since assuming the role as Secretary of State?
Rubio has always been very strong when it came to dictatorships and countries who behave like terrorists, whether it was Iran or whether it was Russia. So his past record stands him in a really good place to be firm in terms of making sure that we get, as I said, not just an end of the murder of innocent Ukrainians, but actually a peace deal that protects European security, that ends the threat to our neighbours and to our continent. But we have to make sure that Ukraine is front and centre of this. In the UK, particularly Conservatives, we are not going to shy away, as the government won't, from saying that Ukraine has to be front and centre. The UK has led before. We have to continue to do that now.
Alicia Kearns, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it. The Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for Foreign Affairs for the Conservatives. As we let Alicia Kearns go, almost certainly now Marco Rubio will step off his plane. Of course, he's touched down there in Riyadh for talks with Russian counterparts. We're not precisely sure who those Russian counterparts will be. One of two massive diplomatic meetings taking place today. The other, of course, the Prime Minister en route to Paris to meet with European leaders. And Mara, it's interesting hearing Alicia Kearns there. I mean, weirdly, I think she was basically saying the same thing as the Prime Minister said in his op-ed, which is we're down for hypothetical boots on the ground, but we're not going to commit to it yet, but just trying to make there be an inch of political difference there to score points. Interesting when it comes to defence spending, she acknowledged that she, as a backbench MP, had been pushing the previous Conservative government to spend more. So on that regard, there wasn't so much Conservative versus Labour point scoring as you might have expected. It's essentially we all should have spent more and we should have done it sooner.
Yeah, I think the difficulty is she is right. As a backbencher, she was always very vocal about defence spending. I think I remember interviewing her a couple of years ago about it. But the difference is when you're in a backbench role, you have the freedom to be able to make those kinds of criticisms. And it's always easy to shout from the backbenches that you think a government should do this, that and the other, when you don't need to be worrying about how to find the cash. So I think when you're in now a shadow ministerial role, suddenly she's a little bit more potentially cagey about that because, again, she's now in a position where she can't spend willy-nilly on behalf of the party, but also she's not in government. And so it's always easier to make those kinds of comments. I think the most important thing to remember is, yes, she was a backbencher, but she represents the party that did not boost that defence spending in the way that she is talking about now, and that could be seen as a failure of the Conservative Party.
We continue to wait to see if Marco Rubio steps off that plane in Riyadh. Just, Mari, pivoting back to the Prime Minister's meeting in Paris today, of course, one big thing we'll be watching for is the mood music amongst European leaders, the level of unity and whether they make a similar pledge about boots on the ground. The other one will be, whether it's today or the days ahead, if the UK formally pledges an increase in defence spending. What gauge for us what's potentially possible there, what would come across as a massive step, a surprisingly big step? Are we talking about 2.3 to 2.4 or is more vaguely possible?
So when it comes to the Strategic Defence Review, we are not expecting the government to decide when and how to get to 2.5% spending of GDP on defence until about May, June. Now, if they bring that forward, I think that would raise some eyebrows, considering they've said that they've been conducting this deep and thorough review so that they can find out exactly how to do that, how it would be sustainable, and how they can find a pathway in terms of tax receipts, percentage of the GDP that we're spending on servicing our own debt, for instance. The debt to GDP ratio is astonishing at the moment. And so I think if anything above 2.5% pledge that we've already heard would be incredibly significant. It would be a huge amount of money, it would be a really big step, and it would be, to an extent, indicative that actually the government was pivoting slightly in its position and reacting and being dynamic to global events. However, what we're hearing from government sources so far is they are being stoic and they are sticking to that 2.5% figure. So I also wouldn't be surprised if they just maintain that. The difficulty will be he's flying over to Paris today, the Prime Minister, to lecture European leaders on spending more on defence, while we are not spending that much more on defence. But also he's talking to countries like Poland that spend a lot more, a hell of a lot more in relation to their GDP on defence than we do.
Mark, great stuff as always. It's a big day for diplomacy, both in Paris and in Riyadh. We will continue to keep you up to speed on both as we do await Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, to step off his plane for his crucial talks with Russia in Riyadh. We'll be right back after this short break here on Sky News Breakfast.
Once almost lost, these denizens of the deep are back.
The problem for these whales is global warming. Water temperatures are rising.
We're worried that the animals are actually starting to starve.
Deadly and outdated. What do you think should happen to the nets?
I would like to see them go.
I'm Nicole Johnston, Sky's Asia correspondent, based here in Beijing.
A towering monument to the China dream and its demise.
From one end of this country to the other, China is littered with real estate that's falling apart.
China is facing a tsunami of the elderly.
We have to work as long as health allows, otherwise, no money.
China is under pressure to pay for the pensions of 500 million retirees. I've reported on a wide range of stories from around the world.
Mass protests forced the president to flee.
The sight of the president's private swimming pool only reinforces to Sri Lankans the great divide here between rich and poor.
aid groups say Gaza is now the world's most dangerous place to be a child.
The Israeli army has raided towns and villages all over the West Bank. These tunnels run all over Gaza. The Gaza Strip is ridden with them.
A referendum designed to unite the country has only deepened its divide.
Sydney's floodplains underwater again.
This is the third or fourth time in 18 months that their homes have gone under.
Sky News, the full story first.
It may seem like a gimmicky toy, but it is part of the global race between the United States and China for new technology. This elite engineering designed to humour and to help us.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
I saw police being forced or pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free, wherever you get your news. The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way. I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Welcome back. It's the beginning of a huge week for diplomacy. European leaders will gather in Paris today for an emergency summit on the war in Ukraine, with fears that they're being sidelined by the White House. America's most senior diplomat, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, has arrived in Saudi Arabia for talks with Russia on ending the war, and he's stepped off his plane just as we went to break. Typical. He is going to start meetings there in Russia. We're still unsure exactly who he'll be meeting. Let's discuss all of this. Joining Mari and I are the former National Security Advisor to the British government, Sir Mark Lyle-Grant, and Lord Peter Ricketts, the former Permanent Undersecretary for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. A very good morning to you both. First, I'll come to you, Lord Ricketts. How significant is it to hear the Prime Minister say that he's willing to put boots on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, this is clearly a very significant moment, and it's right that European leaders are meeting in Paris. I think they need not to be in hand-wringing mode, but coming out with some concrete proposals about how Europe can work more effectively together in support of Ukraine. We've heard a lot about peacekeeping in the last few days. I'm personally wary about the term peacekeeping. I mean, what it has meant in the past is putting your troops between two potential adversaries, necessarily willing to fight to keep the peace. That might mean British soldiers actually fighting Russians. I don't actually think the Russians would accept that a peacekeeping force would be made up only of Ukraine's friends. They would want their friends as well. So you might have, I don't know, Chinese or Iranian troops or others deployed on their side of the line. I think a better concept is a stabilization force. European forces in Ukraine, not necessarily on the front line, but there to show solidarity, to show our support for Ukraine. There, I think British forces ought to absolutely be part of it. That the army is not capable of a very large deployment, but working with the French, for example, the Germans and others, we could put in a significant force. But let's be very clear what it's for and where it would deploy and what would happen if a ceasefire broke down.
So, Mark, what's your take as to the extent to which European leaders will have been shocked, surprised, even scared by some of the rhetoric out of the US in the last week or so, obviously triggering this meeting in Paris today?
Well, I think they will have been very concerned indeed by some of the threads coming out of the messaging from the White House, but also they'll be trying to work out today what some of these mixed messages mean, because we've had different messages about, how and when Ukraine will be involved in the negotiations, whether American military are on the table or off the table for some sort of post-conflict role, as Lord Ricketts was talking about. We've had mixed messages on, this 500 billion rare earth possible deal between Ukraine and the United States. And there's a whole question of the nature of security guarantees that Ukraine can expect once the conflict is over. So I think they'll be working through some of these messages and also sending a very clear signal that Europe is prepared and indeed insists on playing its role in whatever develops after this first initial discussion between the United States and Russia and Saudi Arabia tomorrow.
So, Lord Ricketts, just a question for you. So how do you think this would look in terms of if it is Ukrainian soldiers on the front line, for instance, and European troops kind of behind them, as it were? How would that work in terms of the kind of numbers that would be needed from the UK armed forces, do you reckon?
Well, I think the numbers of forces need to be related to the tasks that they would have. And we've heard talk of 100,000 troops, and that's an enormous force. And if you're going to sustain it over several years, that means several 100,000 available. So I think we need to ask the military planners to work out what a force would do, how many troops would be needed. I mean, as a kind of rule of thumb, when NATO forces were sent to Bosnia in 1995, there were about 60,000. That was including, of course, a lot of American forces. They drew down fairly quickly. Then in 1999 in Kosovo, roughly the same sort of force. That was there to keep the peace deal between Kosovo and Serbia, very different countries than Ukraine and Russia. But that was an order of magnitude. If it's going to be a lot more than that, then I think Europe would frankly find it very difficult to put on the ground anything approaching 100,000 troops. And whatever number it is, they would need support from America. I think we have to accept there aren't going to be American boots on the ground, but there would need to be what the military call enablers, airlift, strategic reconnaissance, all kinds of assets that are in short supply in Europe. America would need to be involved at some level in supporting a Europe-led force.
So, Mark, it seems clear that a part of the thinking behind all of the rhetoric of the last month is to try and from the US I'm talking about, is to try and boost European spending on defence. How much do you think the UK needs to boost its spending to change the way that President Trump looks at the UK? And do you think it's even vaguely feasible that we'll meet whatever that level is?
Well, I think the Prime Minister is determined to increase the levels of defence, and that is clearly required as we enter a much more dangerous and unpredictable world. He's talked about 2.5%, but hasn't set a deadline for that. And I would certainly expect in the next weeks for him to set out a clear timetable for when we will reach 2.5. The defence chiefs are talking about 2.65. President Trump has mentioned 5%. Now, I think that's completely unrealistic in any foreseeable future. But nonetheless, I think both Britain and I think most European countries do recognise the need that they need to ramp up their defence spending pretty quickly now in response to what has happened in recent years.
So Mark, earlier on the programme, we had Alicia Kearns from the Conservatives saying essentially she felt like Keir Starmer's comments were a bit premature with the idea of boots on the ground. Do you think this is an opportunity for the UK to actually show a bit of leadership, or do you agree with Alicia Kearns that perhaps we're being slightly premature in talking about this just now?
Well, I think we are premature in talking about boots on the ground because there's a lot of negotiations to be done between now and then. Eventually, that might indeed be necessary. But as Peter Ricketts has said, it's illusory to think that the Europeans can provide all the credible security guarantees that Ukraine requires without American support or indeed American involvement. So however much the Europeans promise that they're prepared to put troops in, I don't think that in itself is going to be enough. But the much more important prior concern is twofold, that in these negotiations, whatever is discussed about land for peace, the key thing is that there is a credible assurance, guarantee of Ukrainian sovereignty at the end of it, that they will be free to make policy choices for Ukraine's future. And that's something that's not a given that Putin wants Ukraine to become a vassal state of Russia. And on top of that, there need to be these credible security guarantees. And that's where the potential troops come in. But I think we're a very long way from discussing how many troops are required or what particular role they will play.
Peter, how close do you think we are, or how much do you fear a really terrible outcome for Ukraine and I guess with it Europe from the negotiations that are about to start today in Riyadh?
Well, you're right to point to the risk that there could be a really bad outcome. And the really bad outcome comes from Trump being in far too much of a hurry to get a quick deal at any price and prepared to give away a great deal in order to come out with a deal. We had a little bit of that from Defense Secretary Hesketh in Brussels, where he gave away a lot of what would be normally key negotiating issues. Could Ukraine regain territory back to its frontiers of 2014? Would there be American involvement in a peace process? Might Ukraine be able to join NATO one day? The Americans seem to give those away at the start of the negotiation. So yes, a very bad outcome is possible. That leaves Ukraine weak, that leaves Russia triumphant, and that destabilizes European security. But that is absolutely not a given. And I think one of the tasks of European leaders today is to decide how collectively they're going to make the case to the Europeans. Keir Starmer talking about visiting Washington in the next couple of weeks, that it's really important that the time is taken, obviously to involve the Ukrainians, to consult the Europeans, to make sure that Ukraine comes out of a deal in a place to have a strong, prosperous future as an independent, sovereign country, which is what the Americans say they want. But that means forcing some concessions from Russia, some pretty big ones. And that means Trump showing that he's strong in delivering peace, but also a fair peace that produces security in Europe. But beyond that, we do also have to think as Europeans now that the time has come for us to get serious about Europe doing more in its own security. We can no longer depend on any American president, I think, whether Trump or any future president, to do the same degree of support to European security that we've had throughout my and Mark's working lives.
So, Mark, just finally, the same question to you. Are you more fearful, less fearful than Peter about a bad outcome for Ukraine?
Well, I am concerned, as Peter is, and I think it's worrying that we've got these talks happening in Saudi Arabia tomorrow without Ukrainian involvement. And it's worrying, as Peter says, that America seems to put a lot of its cards on the table, and you'll have noticed that the Russians have said absolutely nothing in recent weeks and are certainly not going to sort of prejudge the negotiations. And there is a risk that the Russians will run rings around the Americans when it comes to negotiating over the heads of the Ukrainians. And so I think the Ukrainians need to be in the room as soon as possible, preferably some of the Europeans as well, but certainly the Ukrainians, because any deal that is done over the Ukrainian heads is bound to be a bad deal.
So, Mark, Lord Ricketts, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now moving on to some other news. 2 attacks in Germany have reshaped the country's election, with migration now front and centre of the campaign and a surge in support for the far-right AfD. Our Europe correspondent, Siobhan Robbins, has this report for us.
A battle for power is raging in Germany. For the first time since World War II, a far-right party is expected to come second in a general election. A possibility terrifying opponents.
I've come from a Jewish heritage, so I'm really worried about the safety of my family.
I don't want to believe that 20% of German population is extremist.
The Alternative for Germany, or AfD, denies it's extremist and says it's doing what voters want. But from east to west, thousands have rallied against them, many repelled by their anti-immigration stance.
If we look at this country, it's not my Syrian refugees whose fault it is that my wages are short or that, I don't know, that it's crime. It's not refugees. It's just like what the AfD always tells us, migrants, they kill people with knives.
It's just what you're talking.
What do you think?
It's immediately clear how divided voters are, especially around migration.
I agree with the deportation thing, because we have definitely too much foreigners and there's too much violence. I'm worried about that we're heading directly in a situation of civil war.
Do you think it's that bad?
Yeah, but society is so divided into two parties.
The debate around migration's been amplified after an Afghan man admitted deliberately driving into protesters in Munich just a few days before the vote. It's one of a number of alleged attacks carried out by foreigners in the last year.
This is Germans in Frankfurt cheering as Syrians arrive in 2015. So this is some of 1 million people. And you can see there people cheering.
I won't say it's a mistake, but it was ignorance.
A decision by the then Chancellor Angela Merkel to allow around 1 million refugees to enter the country during the 2015 migrant crisis helped fuel support for the AfD. Satish arrived from India in 2008. He says Germany's become unrecognisable in the last decade. The balance is wrong.
Germany is well aware that you have to integrate, you have to bring skills. Yeah? Immigrants should not be a threat to your country. There you have to draw a line.
While the country's mainstream parties have all hardened their stance on migration, Germany remains divided. A crisis which could push the far right further up the polls. Siobhan Robbins, Sky News, Germany.
That election is on Sunday. Now, a British couple who have been detained as they rode across Iran on a motorcycle trip have been named by their families as Craig and Lindsay Foreman. The couple have been accused of security-related offences. Matthew Thompson is here with this story for us. Matthew, just give us as well a bit of the timeline of when they were apprehended and why we're certainly talking about it again.
Yes, indeed. So we're in February now, obviously, but we think that the couple crossed from Armenia into Iran on the 30th of December, and they were arrested sometime in January. But it's only now that state-backed Iranian media has effectively announced that they've been charged with rather nebulous-sounding security offences. The couple are in their 50s. They're on a motorbike trip across the world. They were supposed to be ending up in Australia. And they had been posting about their trip quite liberally on social media. You can see there some of the pictures from their Instagram. And actually, on the 3rd of January, they posted, to put your minds at rest, we're having the most amazing time in Iran. And just, we assume, days after they posted that, they found themselves being detained. And look, the Foreign Office advises against all but essential travel to Iran. And it basically warns that even just having a British passport can be cause for getting into trouble. You might find yourself quite easily the pawn in some Iranian scheme to get some concession or other from the British government. We have a short statement from the couple's family who've said that this unexpected turn of events has caused significant concern for our entire family, and we are deeply focused on ensuring their safety and well-being during this trying time. And of course, it's almost impossible to talk about people being detained in Iran without mentioning Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who of course was detained there for 6 years. Her husband, Richard Ratcliffe, has spoken out, and he's basically said the government needs to get their skates on and certainly do a quicker job in this case than they did in his wife's case. But interestingly, he's actually taken aim at the Foreign Office guidance on visiting Iran, which he says should actually more clearly state the risk of being taken hostage. In his words, he says, it doesn't matter, it's not personal. It doesn't matter if you've travelled there with a good heart. You can still find yourself, as I say, arrested and potentially used in some scheme or other by the Iranian government.
Matthew, as always, thanks so much. Matthew Thompson. We're going to take a quick break here on Sky News Breakfast. When we come back, we'll speak to the College of Policing as officers begin training on how to address cases of non-contact sexual offences.
We're going to do this 100 times every day for the next 3 months.
Why have we agreed to this?
Raises many questions about many things.
Actually seeing people impacted, she was so upset.
It was powerful. They kind of couldn't believe they were being berated here.
Very much on my terms, I think was the subtext. News happens fast around Donald Trump.
It was a kind of wow moment.
Yeah, that's what it feels like, doesn't it?
It's Trump world, and we just live in it.
So, where next?
Follow Trump 100 wherever you get your podcasts. I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. Do you fear a fourth indictment? Does your government owe an apology to the British home children?
Great to see you.
Does your government owe them an apology? The fact that they were intercepted, does that indicate a military weakness on the part of Iran? No. Free, wherever you get your news. There's no doubting the strength of this hurricane as it roars through. You can feel a devastating power. It had been a difficult night in a deadly storm.
Bang, bang. You can hear it hitting the windows.
Our houses are okay.
It's depressing.
As bad as all of this is, it could have been much worse. Today, this land they call sacred is at the heart of America's electric car revolution.
To me, it's a sacred ground.
The white gold rush is a race that Biden doesn't want to lose. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world. Donald Trump, 45th President of the United States, it would appear is about to learn his fate.
Escort coming out!
San Quentin houses America's largest death row. They rarely allow cameras onto the condemned block.
James Matthews, Sky News. I want to be treated equally like everyone else. It's one step closer to getting out, to getting off death row.
Sky News. Get the full story first. Mr. Trump, James Matthews from Sky News.
Hey, James.
Are you diminished by claims that you're a racist?
Question?
Mr. Musk, has your ignorance and ego cost Ukrainian lives? Vladimir Putin calls you outstanding. What do you call him, sir?
He's from Sky News. He's entitled to ask me questions.
Mandatory evacuation. You must leave.
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's chief North of England correspondent.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Sky News, the full story first. Welcome back. Police officers are to receive improved training on how to respond to cases of non-contact sexual offences, including upskirting, voyeurism and indecent exposure. It's part of a course designed with the help of the mother of murdered student Libby Squire. Joining me now from the College of Policing is Chief Superintendent Jamie Daniels. Jamie, thanks so much for joining us on this. So just tell us a little bit more about this new training programme that you're launching and specifically what it's aimed at addressing.
Thank you very much. So we know that violence against women and girls, women and girls are disproportionately affected across an array of crime types. The important thing about the non-contact sexual offence training is, and inspired by Lady Angelini's recommendations to have a real step change of improvement when it comes to training and guidance in this area, is we recognise that this was about trust and confidence, and this is one core area where we have to see a level of improvement. So we set about building a programme that's designed for frontline staff, call takers, investigators, and supervisors. So we're placing police officers with better tools in the toolbox so they could both respond to, investigate, and tackle this type of crime in a far better way.
Is that something that is very clearly required? Is it not happening at the moment?
It was happening, but this is about pulling together a lot of different areas under one banner. So, for example, we know that Operation Soteria, the way that policing is already tackling contact sexual offences like rape and sexual abuse, was really working, and there was an opportunity here to take the core principles of that particular approach into the non-contact space. And crucially, this was about, and you know, but this is a really important part of this, we were privileged to have the support of people like Lisa, and the poignant case that you've referenced as underpinning this training, because candidly, these are the reasons why you join police, and this is what we are here to do, to stop this type of thing from happening and to investigate it extremely well in the way that the public deserve.
What does the training entail exactly?
Well, it's an hour-long module, and as I say, it's aimed for the frontline staff, it's aimed for supervisors, investigators. There's a knowledge check, It talks about the key principles of soteria, so being suspect-focused, being victim-centred, and being context-led, and gives examples of how that. It talks about the reasonable lines of inquiry that should be followed. It talks about why victims may underreport, and we know this is a massive area of underreporting. You know, there's a cultural issue that this training is aiming to lean in on, which is these are serious offences in their own right. There are patterns of behaviour, and these could be the pieces of the jigsaw that allow the police to work out who is behind some of these crimes. And of course, they can escalate, and we recognise that too. So the 1 hour module takes officers through a journey of learning. As I say, it underpins that learning with these case studies, so that when officers have completed that, they should be far better placed to respond to and tackle this type of crime.
And what about stepping away from the sort of training for police officers? What about people out there who may have experienced non-contact sexual offences but perhaps aren't aware of it, or aren't aware of what the line is before it becomes a criminal offence, and how they should go about reporting it?
Well, it's not okay. I think that's the key message when it comes to tackling this. And people, we know that people, the so-called terms like peeping Tom, so-called revenge porn, in my opinion, these things are actually quite demeaning to the severity these offences represent. We know from a series of studies, we know from the academics we've worked with, these are very harmful crimes in their own right. So my key message to those people would be, it's not okay, report it to the police, have trust, have confidence that we will do a proper investigation, we will work through it, and ultimately that's how we will have a good chance of finding out who is more likely to be behind this. But it's truthfully, it's about recognising in first instance it's not okay, recognising that it's serious in its own right, and we have to have a zero tolerance approach to these types of offences.
Jamie Daniels, Chief Superintendent, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's have a look at the weather for you before we leave you this hour. Well, the cold theme will last a little longer, but it'll be milder for all by Wednesday. It's chilly out there across Britain with a local frost. Most places will have a dry morning with patchy rain and hill snow over western Scotland fading away. There'll be just a few blustery showers in the far northeast, while rain will affect Western Ireland. Cloud will be quite extensive again, but there should be more brightness for southern Britain than recently. It'll be cold for most, milder in the windy west. That's your weather. Well, when we come back, we'll have all of the day's top stories for you, including a big day for diplomacy as the Prime Minister, of course, travels to Paris to meet European leaders. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, has just landed in Riyadh for talks with Russian counterparts brokered by the Saudis. We'll discuss that and very much more when we come back.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Very good morning to you. It's 9 o'clock. On today's show, the Prime Minister says he's ready and willing to put troops in Ukraine as part of a peace deal.
Sir Keir Starmer's decision to speak out comes as he heads to Paris today for an emergency summit.
It's Monday, February the 17th. Your headlines. Sir Keir Starmer says that putting troops in Ukraine helps guarantee security for the whole of Europe, and the government tell this programme Britain needs to set the tone for all.
The front line in Ukraine isn't just a matter for the Ukrainians, it's the front line for the whole of Europe, including Britain's national security.
Good morning from Paris, where European leaders, including Keir Starmer, will gather this afternoon for a hastily arranged emergency summit to discuss their response to Donald Trump's Ukraine peace plan.
Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, lands in Saudi Arabia for talks this week with Russian officials about ending the war in Ukraine.
Also ahead, fears for the British bikers held prisoner by Iran. And Conclave and the Brutalists share the spoils at the 78th BAFTAs award ceremony. A very good morning to you. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has said that the UK is ready and willing to put British troops on the ground in Ukraine to protect peace. He'll travel to Paris today for an emergency summit with European leaders. Well, in a moment, we'll speak to our international correspondent, Diana Magnay, who's in Jerusalem, and our political correspondent, Mario Aurora, who's here with me. But first, let's speak to our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons, who's in Paris for us. Adam, this was hastily assembled, this gathering, hugely significant, and I guess the Prime Minister has set the tone on one point of discussion with his op-ed this morning.
Yeah, I think that idea of putting troops on the ground will be certainly stimulating for the discussion. But that idea also of a European army is one that has been proposed by Emmanuel Macron, the French president, previously, and it will be rising up the agenda again this afternoon when Macron hosts this meeting of some European leaders, those effectively with the biggest military force. Now, make no mistake, this is an emergency meeting, hastily put together and done so in response to European leaders being left, A, on the back foot, and B, to be blunt, insulted by the words of J.D. Vance when he spoke in Munich. Some of the diplomats that I've been in touch with say they felt condescended, patronised, and they feel that America is now taking them for granted and that they are astonished that the United States is trying to sideline Ukraine and Europe in peace talks about Ukraine. So this is about European leaders trying to take back the advantage, to trying to put forward a united front in how they respond. For one thing, they think it's unconscionable that they wouldn't be included in peace discussions because Ukraine clearly is on the eastern border of Europe. It has intrinsic ties, economic, cultural, social, historic with Europe that it doesn't have with the United States. They feel that they have led the way in fighting the political battle with Russia. They also worry about the precedent that is being set at the moment by the United States, what seems to be this rapidly fraying relationship between European nations and the US. This will be a very significant meeting.
Adam, just a quick follow-up. Of course, this all leads to how easy it is to boost defence spending here in the UK. If we pick out France and Germany, for example, is it even harder for them to find the flexibility financially, politically to do so?
I think politically a lot of these countries, I mean, Germany certainly, I think, believes that it has some flex, although its economy is struggling at the moment. The French, well, Macron has political capital and investing more in his military. But there are nations like Spain that spends a tiny amount, less than 1.5% of its GDP on the military. Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, she said very bluntly, we need to spend more on defence. I think that will be held, not least because NATO will want people to spend more, and also because if the US is backing away from Europe, well, it's obvious, isn't it? European nations are going to have to spend more on defence.
Adam, thanks so much for that. In Paris, the Prime Minister, of course, will be there in the next few hours. Let's go now to Diana, who's in Jerusalem. Just, an hour ago, less than an hour ago, we saw Marco Rubio step off the plane in Riyadh. Diana, break down for us who we think he's meeting there and the significance of this first salvo between the US and Russia.
Well, it is very significant because it's the first point that we have had negotiations on a diplomatic level like this since Russia invaded Ukraine. But I think what Marco Rubio has been trying to emphasise is that this is really very preliminary, these kinds of discussions. They are talks about getting talks going. They're not even talks about the process of peace. We know from Donald Trump that he wants to hold a summit with Vladimir Putin in Riyadh. A week and a half ago, Marco Rubio's scheduled visit to Riyadh was already announced before Trump had dropped that bombshell that he'd spoken to the Russian president. So I think Marco Rubio will be talking to the Crown Prince about a number of issues, about the Middle East, about Iran, but also very significantly about Ukraine. And Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy, Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, are going to be landing also in Saudi Arabia today ahead of talks, we believe, tomorrow with Russian officials. As to who that will be, we don't know yet. The Russians have given no clarification, and Marco Rubio said that it was unclear yet who it would be. I would be surprised if Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, didn't fly in for that meeting, given the three heavyweights from the United States part who will be attending. We do understand from Reuters that Kirill Dmitriev, who is the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund and who has been very instrumental alongside Saudi Arabia in some of these prisoner exchanges that have taken place between Russia and Ukraine over the past 2.5 years of war, to be involved in the talks. And interestingly, on that note, Volodymyr Zelensky arrived in the United Arab Emirates last night, and he talked about how his first priority was getting his people back home. Presumably, the kinds of talks that he will be having there are also around further prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine. You know, the Saudis were very involved in the exchange last week of Mark Fogel, the teacher in Russian custody, back to the United States, and of course in that massive prisoner swap last year with, among others, Evan Gershkovich. So you see now how Arab mediators are really trying to take centre stage. I suppose a neutral place to hold peace talks away from Europe, for Ukraine and Russia. We know from Keith Kellogg that so far there will be parallel tracks for Ukraine and Russia. But Marco Rubio said last night, you know, when we get to actual peace talks, of course, Ukraine will be involved. They were the country that were invaded. When we are talking peace, they will be at the table. But I think his point is this is really very early stages. I'll just quote you the line he said, "Even the longest journey begins with a first step." And that is what these meetings in Riyadh are all about.
Diana Magnay, thanks so much for that live in Jerusalem. In a moment, Mari and I will wrap up what this all means domestically for the political situation. But first, we spoke 2 hours ago to the US National Security Advisor, General H.R. McMaster, former NSA advisor to President Trump in his first term. We asked him about Sir Keir Starmer's willingness to commit British troops to Ukraine.
I think it's very significant. And I think what is really important here is how much there's been continuity in the British position here across now two governments, you know, and that bipartisan support for Ukraine has been significant because it's really been the UK that has pushed ahead in support for Ukraine. I think one of the reasons we're in the position we're in is the degree to which the Biden administration meted out assistance to Ukraine and tried to manage the conflict. When in fact, if they had been able to just give everything that Ukraine needed up front, then I don't think we'd maybe even be in this position because Russia is taking like unsustainable losses already, and it was the UK that provided some of the new lethal capabilities early and pushed the United States to do the same.
I'm interested in your take on where European defence spending is. I mean, the UK is at 2.3%. Some are expecting the Prime Minister to announce 2.5 quicker than otherwise. Is 2.5 irrelevant now, or is it a bit rich of the US to sort of change the nature of what the pledge should be? I mean, things do change, but it's in light of where our finances are in this country, it's pretty hard to get to much more than that anytime soon.
I think what's important just to remember in general is, hey, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to prevent a war than to have to fight one. And I think what's more important than the 2.5 or 2.65 debate that I read about going on here in the UK is what kind of force do you want to have? And what you need is a military force that can operate for sufficient duration and an ample scale to prevail in a conflict, hopefully as part of an alliance like within NATO. And that's really what is at stake. I think what's happened is we have traded off for way too many years now capacity in our armed forces for what we believe were going to be more and more exquisite capabilities that would guarantee our security. Well, hey, guess what? We've seen our enemies, potential enemies, adversaries, develop countermeasures to those capabilities.
Do you think the UK would be capable of having a genuine peacekeeping force in Ukraine based on the current state of our military?
Well, I don't not the UK on its own, I don't think, because of the size of the armed forces. Now, you have a tremendously capable, professional force, that I would want to pick first to fight alongside within an alliance or a coalition. But it's just the question of scale, the depth in the armed forces.
Can Europe do it on its own, or does the US have to be involved? And when, again, going back to all the rhetoric we see from President Trump and his new advisors and team to say that they're not going to be a part of anything like that, is that a bluff to get us to spend more, or is it a legitimate threat that worries you?
Well, it worries me because so much of our infrastructure, our logistics, it's all integrated within NATO. And that's what allows us to burden share. And this is, again, one of these elements of dissonance with President Trump. He wants more burden sharing, but at times he can be skeptical of the alliances that actually make that burden sharing feasible and possible. I think, though, what he would want to do is take credit for some increases in defense spending because he's cajoling everyone into it. And, of course, what's important to remember is he's not the first U.S. president to make this case. I mean, this has been across multiple administrations. And the American people in particular, I mean, they have a sense, many of them have a sense, that Europe has been free riding on the largesse of American taxpayers. And that's a real sentiment in the United States. President Trump didn't create that. He kind of more reflects that, I think. And it's important, I think, for all of us to recognize it's a very dangerous period. Heck, North Korean troops are fighting alongside Russians in the first major land war in Europe since World War II.
That was retired General H.R. McMaster. So, Mari, I guess the question is, what does this all mean domestically? Both this pledge that there's a willingness after a peace deal to put boots on the ground in Ukraine, but also what it means for defence spending.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there are still so many unanswered questions around this pledge. The PM writing in the Telegraph this morning saying, he doesn't take these decisions lightly. He understands the kind of the gravity of pledging to have British servicemen and women on the ground in Ukraine and what that could mean for a peacekeeping force. But nonetheless, Wes Streeting, speaking to you earlier, trying to explain and justify the government and the Prime Minister's thought process and how they've come to this conclusion and why they believe it is not just good for Ukraine, but good for the UK. And on the other side, for the Conservatives, Alicia Kearns, actually trying to be a little bit more contrarian on this topic. She feels, actually, they've gone a little bit too early pledging these boots on the ground.
The case he'll be making with European leaders today, as well as in Washington with President Trump next week, is that as well as securing an end to this war, we have to secure a lasting peace and the security of Europe, including Britain's national security. And he's willing to commit, if necessary, British troops to a peacekeeping force to secure our own national security, Ukraine's security and European security at large.
Well, I'm quite cautious because we're not at a place in which we understand the terms or the conditions or the numbers or the way in which we've been deploying our people. And we should always make sure that we are making decisions based on as much information as possible. The reality is that Ukraine is still fighting for its freedom. Russia has taken around 600 square miles of territory over the last few months. We're not in a place as yet where I think we can be making those commitments. But in terms of standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, we've demonstrated we will do that time and time again, and we will give them what we need. But I just think we're not in that place as yet. Things are going to change over the next few hours, let alone the next few days, weeks and months.
Mari, what did you make of that sort of pushback from the Conservatives? It was probably not what we expected.
Yeah, it's an interesting position for the Conservatives, but the Conservatives are always normally quite strong when it comes to defence. During the election campaign, Rishi Sunak pledged to get to 2.5% of spending on GDP on defence by 2030, whereas Labour didn't set a target to that. So often the Conservatives are considered to be a little bit more pro-defence, defence spending, as it were. So it's interesting that Alicia Kearns there was quite... she was quite candid in her reticence to support the government's position on this. Also interesting, considering we've had in the past hour Rishi Sunak, former Prime Minister, posting on X that he wholeheartedly supports Keir Starmer's position when it comes to possible boots on the ground. So you don't have this kind of consensus in the Conservative Party at the moment on this. Nonetheless, Alicia Kearns wasn't ruling it out. Well, what she was saying was she felt it was premature and therefore she didn't want to deal in hypotheticals. But it is an interesting position for the Conservatives to take, especially considering they feel that one of their legacies, one of the positive things from when they were in government was their support for Ukraine.
Yeah, really interesting. Mari, as always, thanks so much. Let's have a look at some of the other stories making headlines now. And at least 9 people have been killed as storms sweep across part of the United States. The weather's mainly impacted southeastern states, with 8 people dead in Kentucky and 1 in Georgia. Meteorologists say this bout of weather is the 10th and coldest polar vortex of the season. Police are still searching for the suspect behind the fatal Valentine's Day shooting at a Kent pub. A woman in her 40s was shot at the Three Horseshoes in Knockolt near Sevenoaks just after 7 p.m. and was pronounced dead at the scene. Police believe that the perpetrator may have entered the River Thames. British cyclist Geraint Thomas has confirmed via his X account that he'll be retiring at the end of the season. In his 19-year career, he's won the Tour de France in 2018, is an Olympic double-track cycling champion and received an OBE in 2019. The Welshman does say he has some big races to prep for this season. The College of Policing has launched special training for officers dealing with non-contact sexual offences. Sky's Sadia Chowdhury was given an exclusive look at what this training aims to achieve.
It was November and she was walking home and a man had exposed himself to her.
She can't be sure, but Lisa thinks this was the man who later became her daughter's killer.
I did not say to her to report it to the police because I didn't know better. Because it's one of those things that, as a young person myself, you're just conditioned to accept these things happen to women.
Months later, Powell Relowich raped and murdered Libby Squire. Jurors at his trial were told he had 13 previous non-contact sexual offences. 2 years later, Wayne Couzens kidnapped, raped and murdered Sarah Everard. He too had a history of non-contact sexual offences.
It was only, I think, a year after Libby had died that Sarah Everard died. And I was annoyed because I thought we're getting nowhere. You know, there are signs here and we're ignoring them.
A non-contact sexual offence is any sexual gesture that is unwanted and not a contact. It includes things like upskirting, voyeurism and exposing yourself to others. It's a red flag and often a gateway offence to more serious, violent crimes. This was the inquiry into how a known voyeur like Wayne Couzens could slip through the net and commit more serious crimes.
I'm calling for a step change in the way police respond to indecent exposure cases. More research is needed to understand the link between this offence and the likely trajectory towards serious contact offending. And even without that trajectory, victims deserve to have their cases investigated properly each and every time.
Never has it been more important than we get the response to these types of crime right.
Lisa Squire has teamed up with the College of Policing to devise a training course for police officers and staff who respond to non-contact sexual offences.
If we can get that message right in terms of how we respond, we build that trust, we have better outcomes of victims, and we start to see the improvements that the public rightly demand and deserve.
Lisa says it is not just the police who need a better response to these offences. She's targeting the courts next. Tougher sentences, she says, are needed to really make a difference. Sadia Chowdhury, Sky News, at the College of Policing in London.
Now, a British couple who've been detained as they rode across Iran on a motorcycle trip have been named by the families as Craig and Lindsay Foreman. The couple have been accused of security-related offences. Well, Matthew Thompson's here with the details of this. Matthew, they've crossed into Iran when exactly, and why are we talking about it again now?
So they've been there for quite a while, actually. We think they crossed from Armenia into Iran on the 30th of December and were arrested at some point in January. But it's only now that Iranian-backed state media basically has announced that they've been charged with these rather nebulous-sounding security offences. And they had actually been documenting that. You can see there on social media their motorcycle trip right across the world, and they've been documenting it on Instagram on the 3rd of January. In fact, they rather ominously posted, "To put your minds at rest, we're having the most amazing time in Iran." And we assume mere days after posting that, they found themselves detained. And then in another interesting post, they said that they were aware of the risks of being in Iran, but they thought that the rewards they described as meeting incredible people and seeing the breathtaking landscapes outweighed the fear. But the Foreign Office recommends against all but essential travel to Iran, and it actually points out in its guidance that even just holding a British passport can put you at risk. We've got a statement from the couple's family, who have said that this unexpected turn of events has caused significant concern for our entire family, and we are deeply focused on ensuring their safety and well-being during this trying time. But of course, it's almost impossible to talk about Brits being detained in Iran without mentioning Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who of course spent 6 years in Iranian custody before finally being freed. And interestingly, her husband, Richard Ratcliffe, has now spoken out against this and essentially warned the British state to get its skates on and deal with this more promptly than it managed to do with his wife. And another interesting thing he's targeted is actually that Foreign Office guidance I mentioned a moment ago. He says should actually more specifically reference the threat of being taken hostage, that it's not a personal thing. It doesn't matter if you arrive in Iran with the best of intentions, you can still find yourself arrested and used in a pawn in the Iranian state.
The Foreign Office guidance, though, is already fairly clear.
Well, as I say, it does say, you know, holding a British passport could put you at risk. I suppose what Richard Ratcliffe is aiming at is that he thinks it should be made clearer that regardless of your intentions of being in Iran, you could, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could find yourself being detained through no fault of your own and nothing to do with your own personal circumstances.
Matthew, great stuff, thank you. We're going to take a quick break here on Sky News Breakfast. When we come back, the 80-day countdown to the 80th anniversary of VE Day gets underway. And David Tennant singing Wallace and Gromit's winning. Not singing Wallace and Gromit. David Tennant is singing and Wallace and Gromit winning. We'll have the latest from the BAFTAs.
We're trying to see as much as we can.
We start with breaking news. Historic day here today.
The golden age of America begins right now.
A long-awaited ceasefire is now underway.
First question, Sky News.
This is a huge moment. It's incredible. Now to California.
Do you owe citizens an apology? Have you nothing to say?
Jane Secker, Sky News. Would you like to respond to us now?
Beth Rigby, Sky News.
In principle, would you agree to do that?
Criticism of you is banned. How is this a fair election?
The cameras are poised, waiting to see what the president might do next.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Once almost lost, these denizens of the deep are back.
The problem for these whales is global warming. Water temperatures are rising.
We're worried that the animals are actually starting to starve.
Deadly and outdated. What do you think should happen to the net?
I would like to see them go.
I'm Nicole Johnston, Sky's Asia correspondent, based here in Beijing.
A towering monument to the China dream and its demise.
From one end of this country to the other, China is littered with real estate that's falling apart. China is facing a tsunami of the elderly.
We have to work as long as health allows, otherwise, no money.
China is under pressure to pay for the pensions of 500 million retirees. I've reported on a wide range of stories from around the world.
Mass protests forced the president to flee.
The sight of the president's private swimming pool only reinforces to Sri Lankans the great divide here between rich and poor.
Aid groups say Gaza is now the world's most dangerous place to be a child.
The Israeli army has raided towns and villages all over the West Bank.
These tunnels run all over Gaza. The Gaza Strip is ridden with them. A referendum designed to unite the country has only deepened its divide.
Sydney's floodplains underwater again.
This is the third or fourth time in the 18 months that their homes have gone under.
Sky News, the full story first.
It may seem like a gimmicky toy, but it is part of the global race between the United States and China for new technology. This elite engineering designed to humour and to help us.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free, wherever you get your news.
The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Welcome back. As we discuss the most serious conflict in Europe since the Second World War and the possible deployment of British troops in Ukraine as a peacekeeping force, preparations are underway to mark the 80th anniversary of VE Day. Let's cross to Shaman Freeman-Powell, who's in central London for us. Shaman, what exactly we're talking about? This is building up to when exactly?
It is. It's building up to the 80-year anniversary. Today's event marks 80 days until that occasion. That's when there will be a concert at the Royal Albert Hall. But you might be able to hear beside me that this is a teaser event. It's a reminder that this year is a very big year, especially for the few veterans that are still alive to reflect on World War II. There's likely to be lots of music throughout the course of today, 1940s music, as well as dancing a little later on today. But as I say, it's about remembering the heroes of history, and SAFA, the Armed Forces charity that have put this event on today. So it's a chance to publicly thank the veterans. I'm actually joined now by Lady Walmsley. She is the Vice Chair of SAFA charity, who can tell us a little bit more about what to expect today. Why is today's event significant?
Well, it's so important with 80 days to go till VE Day that the British public can thank the veterans who served on our behalf to protect our freedoms and keep us safe. So there's going to be dancing and music and recollections from veterans, recollections from people who were children at the time of the war and evacuated, and a real chance to sort of do all that we do best here to celebrate the people that served on our behalf.
And it is significant, isn't it? At the moment, we have a conflict in Europe with Putin's war on Ukraine. There's lots of talk as well about how much we spend on our defence. Can you reflect on that and why it's important to not only remember those World War II veterans, but also important to reflect on why it's so significant today?
Well, it's exactly the same as it was in World War II. The people fought to keep us safe, to keep us free, to protect our freedoms and everything in life that we take for granted. And there are fewer and fewer people alive today who remember World War II, But the war that is being fought in Ukraine would be very familiar to the people that fought back in those days. It's the same thing. It's people's identity and people's freedom. And, you know, we have to support them. We have to defend what is right for us.
And what message would you like leaders here in the UK and across Europe to take away from today?
I think it's really important to remember that, as in 80 years ago, in this country, people joined the armed forces voluntarily to serve and protect us, and that no one who joins the armed forces should ever have to battle alone. We are here for them. We are here behind them.
Thank you very much. As you can see, there is movement behind me. I actually want to take a little look, if we can, at this Spitfire that's directly behind me. There are people now gathering to take a look at this. This is a modelled Spitfire. It's a Spitfire modelled on the Battle of Britain Spitfire used in the Second World War. It's a symbol of victory for the British. As you can see, lots of people now gathering to take pictures in front of it. This is the start of today's celebration. Which, as I say, at the Royal Albert Hall, we'll see musicians, it will see dancers, and we'll see those veterans still alive to remember and reflect on World War II, sharing their stories about the sacrifices they made.
Shimon, great stuff. Thanks so much for that, Shimon Freeman-Powell. Still coming on The Breakfast Show this morning.
Conclave.
A film about selecting the next pope takes the top gong at the BAFTAs. We'll be discussing that. Welcome back to Sky News Breakfast. A reminder of the top stories this hour. The Prime Minister said he's ready and willing to put British troops on the ground in Ukraine if a peace deal is made. Keir Starmer is one of several European leaders meeting in Paris today for emergency talks on the war. Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has arrived in Saudi Arabia to meet with Russian officials for talks on ending the war. Well, let's get more on the situation in Ukraine now. And our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, is in Lviv and sent us this analysis on what British troops on the ground could mean.
It's a hugely significant announcement. You'll know, of course, that the UK and other allies have been very clear that they don't want to send boots on the ground in Ukraine since Russia's full-scale war almost 3 years ago now. But for the last year or so, there have been private conversations going on, increasingly becoming public, about what next. What can Ukraine's allies do to help support this country in the event of some kind of negotiated settlement? The US has made clear that Ukraine will not immediately be a member of NATO. So one rung down from that is NATO boots on the ground to try to deter Russia from attacking again. And here in this country, of course, they want an end to the war, but they want to make sure that Russia is deterred from fighting again and not just given respite to rearm and re-attack.
Deborah Haynes there for us in Lviv. Meanwhile, Rishi Sunak has also commented on Keir Starmer's words this morning. The former PM said, "Good to see Britain leading on this. We must ensure that any peace in Ukraine is permanent, not just a pause in the Russian assault." As I said in Parliament last week, the government will have my support. Of course, a slightly different tone to that we got from Alicia Kearns, part of Kemi Badenoch's shadow Conservative team earlier on the show. Let's take a look at some of the morning's other stories. Figures have been released which show that an extra 2 million NHS appointments were delivered in the first 5 months of the Labour government, including for chemotherapy, radiotherapy and diagnostic tests. Speaking to Sky News this morning, the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, acknowledged there are still struggles ahead.
Still enormous challenges in the NHS, a hell of a lot more to do on waiting lists, on A&E response times and ambulance response times, on people's ability to get a GP appointment, which aren't covered in today's figures. So I don't pretend there aren't still enormous challenges. I'm not doing victory laps, but I think it's important when people are so cynical about, frankly, politics, politicians, and whether any of us can deliver anything we say, that we are reporting back to the country saying, we said we'd deliver 2 million more appointments in the first year. We've delivered early, a lot done, a hell of a lot more to do.
The Health Secretary Wes Streeting with us earlier. Singer Shakira has been taken to hospital, forcing her to cancel one of her concerts in Peru. The singer posted on Instagram saying she'd been suffering from an abdominal issue. It's not quite barbecue weather, but temperatures could hit 14 degrees by the middle of this week. That's after an anti-cyclonic gloom brought dull skies and below-average temperatures to the country for the last fortnight. Well, that's one term for it. Freezing is another. Now, a film about cardinals electing the next pope has won the top award for Best Film at the BAFTAs last night. Conclave also took home the gong for Outstanding British Film, but was edged out on acting prizes, with The Brutalist and Anora taking home the Best Actor and Actresses gong. I'm joined now by entertainment journalist Josh Rom and our own Bethany Minnell. Very good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Let's start off, Bethany, with a bit of the highlights from last night. Just talk us. I think you were both there.
Yes, we were.
I was adjacent to the ceremony, it's fair to say. Yeah, we were covering the red carpet, we were live blogging it. It was quite a night, wasn't it? I mean, David Tennant was on for the second year running. Quite a party, kicking it off with a kilt. Some cracking speeches, as you would always expect from the big stars.
You would, and some amazing arrivals and some big headlines. So what's the first big moment you want to bring us, Bethany?
Well, I guess you've always got to look at those emotional speeches. We're talking like the Gwyneth Paltrow moments here, aren't we? And the award for that one definitely has to go to Zoe Saldana, one of the stars of Emilia Perez, one of the frontrunners across all of award season, up until recently when it has fallen behind for several reasons. However, Zoe Saldana has been a kind of constant star. She is one of the co-leads. She sings, she dances, she acts, she does everything in this. And we saw her take home Best Supporting Actress. We were widely expecting her to, but she gave a cracking speech, got very emotional, and kind of gave a big thumbs up to us Brits, didn't she? Almost an honorary Brit. This is what she said in her very emotional speech.
This is so validating and a true honor, because the very few times that I won for a part with a British accent, the dialect coach was like, this is not gonna happen for you. And even though I do love a British accent, I have a lot of British friends, I always find myself just repeating their phrases like Gaza and of course, and I know that I'm a pain in the arse.
Very good self-deprecating humour as well there at the end, Josh.
Yes, absolutely. And actually what you didn't see in that speech was a couple of expletives thrown in, and then, of course, she was escorted subsequently off stage.
Not presumably for the expletives.
No, just because of timing issues.
Timings are tight.
But what was
Otherwise, I was going to say the expletives must have been really bad.
Yeah. But what was really nice, actually, was backstage after the speech, she actually paid tribute to her trans nephew and said that she was doing the film for him, which was a really nice touch. And actually, Zoe Saldana is the real high point of Emilia Perez. Of course, this is a film that has been completely dogged by controversy all the way through award season, from Jacques Audiard's comments about the Spanish language to then Carla Sofia Gascon's let's just say, offensive tweets that have resurfaced from a few years back. So Emilia Perez has kind of been seen recently as a bit of a toxic brand. Zoe Saldana very much proving that despite all of that, she still has the momentum going into the Oscars.
Bethany, bring us the next clip, because coming into the evening last night, The Brutalist was probably, what, favourite to win the most awards or the biggest awards?
It's a tough year, to be honest. It's been a hard one for everyone to call, but it's definitely up there among the top runners. And actually, Brutalist and Conclave came out pretty much neck and neck. Conclave slightly taking it because it took Best Film, which is traditionally the biggest prize. But yes, really in the Best Actor award, well, not a surprise, but maybe many expected Ralph Fiennes to take the prize. It is the BAFTAs, after all. But no, Adrien Brody took it, and he too was full of praise for the British people and the British creative industry.
I was brave enough to step back on the stage here and lived here for a while in London, and so this is incredibly meaningful, as England has felt quite a bit like home lately.
So, Bethany, talk us through what other ones The Brutalist got. It got 4 in total. I mean, Best Actor's obviously a huge gong.
Yeah.
What were the other ones?
Big deal. It got Best Director as well. That's Brody Corbet. I mean, it's a 3.5-hour epic film plus a 15-minute interval. A lot of people have heard a lot about the length of it. Really good film, very moving. Brody Corbet gave a very moving speech and actually kind of summed up awards ceremonies in general and said there's no such thing as Best Director, and really he felt that applied to all the categories. They're awards, aren't they? It's a competition. Actually, all the films are really great. But yeah, so it took Best Director, Adrien Brody took Best Leading Actor. It also took Cinematography and Original Score. It's paving the way well for the Oscars coming up in a couple of weeks.
Well, I mean, interesting on that topic, Josh. Were we expecting Conclave to get Best Film because of the sort of extra British vote, or could Conclave get the Oscar now?
I mean, I do doubt that Conclave will get the Oscar, just because, you know, we have Peter Strawn, who was the screenwriter for that, and Ralph Fiennes, a British acting royalty. So it's not surprising that Conclave really got the recognition that it got last night at the BAFTAs. However, I did think, as we were going through the ceremony, I was thinking Brody Corbet director, cinematography, original score, then Adrien Brody got actor. I was thinking, I think The Brutalist might have the edge here. But then saying that, when we're looking towards the Oscars, we cannot forget Honora. Mikey Madison last night, a surprise win, really the main shock of the night, actually.
Absolutely. She elbowed Demi Moore out of that
completely elbowed her out the race. Complete shock of the night was Mikey Madison winning leading actress. But we cannot forget the sweep that it's had. Directors Guild Award, Writers Guild Award, Producers Guild Award. Honora has had a complete sweep in Hollywood with the Critics' Choice recently as well. So we're waiting to see the Screen Actors Guild Awards coming up.
Yes,
we're waiting a few weeks' time. We're waiting for those results. But that's the thing. Honora, it's building momentum. Mikey Madison has been doing a huge push in the UK recently on the talk shows, on the radio shows. So she's been in voters' faces. She's gaining momentum. So really, in between with Demi Moore and Fernando Torres, we're looking at a very interesting leading actress race.
Sometimes the BAFTAs call it almost 100%. Last year, Other than one prize, they pretty much called the Oscars.
But that is because of
the year
Oppenheimer.
Before, not. Yes,
Oppenheimer was just sweeping everything, wasn't it?
The year before it did not.
You're right.
Josh and Bethany, I would love to keep chatting about this as well as some of the sort of behind-the-scenes stories, but annoyingly, we are out of time because there is some breaking news that we have to get to. But thank you both very much for that breakdown of all of the key news from the BAFTAs last night. Now, back to our top story of the day, and need to bring in our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett, for this breaking news. Ivor, we've been waiting to hear exactly who's going to Riyadh to meet Marco Rubio. What can you tell us?
Yeah, we've just finally got confirmation from the Russian side that, A, these talks are taking place in Riyadh tomorrow, that Russian and US officials will be meeting each other as the start of these negotiations. And we've also now we've got a cast list from the Russian side. Their delegation will be led by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Presidential aide Yuri Ushakov. And this is a very senior delegation indeed, clearly, who will be meeting Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Middle East envoy for the US, Steve Witkoff, and the White House National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. So clearly Moscow is taking this very seriously indeed. It's the first high-level in-person contact between US and Russian officials in years since, I think, November 2021, so before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So it's a very significant moment indeed, and these talks all serve as a precursor, of course, for what is expected to be the main event, the in-person meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. We don't yet know when that will be. We're led to believe it will also be happening in the Saudi capital at some point, perhaps in a matter of weeks, perhaps before the end of February. I mean, clearly, judging by the developments of the last 6 days since Donald Trump confirmed his telephone call with Vladimir Putin, things are moving extremely rapidly. The question is, where does all this leave Ukraine? Kiev is extremely concerned about being sidelined by these talks as Moscow and Washington get together. Last week, Donald Trump said that Ukraine would be at these talks in Saudi Arabia, but that's clearly not the case. Volodymyr Zelensky, he is in the region, but he's in the United Arab Emirates, and he says he has no plans to meet with Russian or US officials in Saudi. Clearly, but he wants to ensure that he is on the same page as the US and Europe before speaking with Russia. Now, Marco Rubio, you see here on his arrival in Riyadh this morning, he has sought to play down the significance of these talks and the concerns that Ukraine has. According to him, these aren't the real negotiations, more a test of how serious Vladimir Putin is about wanting to make peace. But I think Ukraine will foresee these otherwise. I think they will see these talks as a test of how serious the US is about being an honest broker in these peace negotiations.
Ivor, as always, thanks so much for bringing us that breaking news and added context. Ivor Bennett for us in Moscow. We're going to take a quick break here on Sky News Breakfast. When we come back, we'll have all of the day's very latest news. Don't go anywhere.
Once almost lost, these denizens of the deep are back. The problem for these whales is global warming. Water temperatures are rising.
We're worried that the animals are actually starting to starve.
Deadly and outdated. What do you think should happen to the nets?
I would like to see them go.
I'm Nicole Johnston, Sky's Asia correspondent, based here in Beijing. A towering monument to the China dream and its demise. From one end of this country to the other, China is littered with real estate that's falling apart. China is facing a tsunami of the elderly.
We have to work as long as health allows, otherwise, no money.
China is under pressure to pay for the pensions of 500 million retirees. I've reported on a wide range of stories from around the world. Mass protests forced the president to flee. The sight of the president's private swimming pool only reinforces to Sri Lankans the great divide here between rich and poor. Aid groups say Gaza is now the world's most dangerous place to be a child. The Israeli army has raided towns and villages all over the West Bank. These tunnels run all over Gaza. The Gaza Strip is ridden with them. A referendum designed to unite the country has only deepened its divide. Sydney's floodplains underwater again. This is the third or fourth time in the 18 months that their homes have gone under. Sky News, the full story first. It may seem like a gimmicky toy, but it is part of the global race between the United States and China for new technology. This elite engineering, designed to humour and to help us.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's chief North of England correspondent.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away? Sky News, the full story first.
I just took a shower above the clouds. You know why? Because this is the Emirates A380. Fly Emirates, fly better.
Welcome back. Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative Party leader, is speaking in East London. We're going to listen to this for just a little bit to see the extent to which she's addressing the main story of the day, and that's Keir Starmer's comments about potentially boots on the ground
As the world
in
becomes
Ukraine.
more complicated, we need to bravely fight for these values now. Instead, we are distracted. Too busy critiquing and deconstructing what previous generations built, rather than making sure that the very best of our inheritance is left intact for the next generation. This is the real poison.
We're going to continue to monitor those remarks that she's making at the moment. Mari's with me, and Mari, we are pretty focused on whether she's going to come out during the course of today, whether it's in this speech or not, and back the government's decision to say that we're potentially willing to put boots on the ground in Ukraine or not?
Yeah, so we're waiting to hear from her as leader of the opposition. The only thing we've got so far is from Shadow Security Minister Alicia Kearns this morning speaking to you, and she was quite reticent to support the Prime Minister's position on this. I think we can have a listen to exactly what she said. So the question will be, is this the position of Kemi Badenoch now, or will she come out and maybe slightly change or soften her rhetoric?
So we're not going to listen to that right now. Forgive us for that. Let's go to Diana Magnay now, live, just because we have some developments on that breaking news that Ivor Bennett brought us moments ago in terms of who is travelling to the Middle East and when exactly they're travelling. Diana, what can you tell us?
Well, I think it's very interesting that the Kremlin are saying that it is as high level as it is, and hardly surprising that we're now going to have a meeting between Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. We know also that Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy who has been instrumental in securing the release last week of Mark Fogel, who had been an American kept in a Russian jail, will be attending, and the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. And on the Russian side, also Yuri Ushakov, who is an aide to the president. Marco Rubio, in an interview last night to CBS, the American network CBS, pitched this very much as sort of preliminary talks ahead of actually putting in some kind of peace process. You know, it would be premature to talk about who was coming, and he said he's just really following up on Donald Trump's calls to get some kind of talks going. But I think the fact that they are at this kind of a level, foreign minister level, when there have been no meetings between officials diplomatically since Russia invaded Ukraine, is a very, very major step. And to hear Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, say that this is about restoring the whole of US-Russia relations is also remarkable. You know, that seemed to be the big umbrella that he pitched this in, where peace in Ukraine was just part of this broader peace between the US and Russia. So I think in Russia's mind, this is about removing sanctions. This is about restoring relations as they were before. And I think, you know, the kind of language, the kind of admiration that we've seen from Donald Trump towards Vladimir Putin in the past speaks to the fact that, you know, he sees the world as great powers talking to great powers. That is absolutely what Vladimir Putin wants. He wants to be seen as one of the great powers sitting at the top table. He hated the fact that the invasion of Ukraine meant that he was ousted really from, you know, a seat at the top table. So this is really falling into exactly what Russia wants. Does Marco Rubio, does Donald Trump have the capacity to make sure that, you know, Russia doesn't get exactly what it wants in these negotiations? We shall have to see. Marco Rubio said that Donald Trump was an arch negotiator and would be able to tell pretty quickly whether he can trust Russia or not. That all remains to be seen.
I'm just going to quickly say, Diana, we're sort of short of time, but the other sort of person that's come in from the cold and probably happy to be seen as a significant player in power is MBS.
That's very true. It is a very different world now from the one where we have Saudi journalists being taken into Turkish embassies and cut apart. You know, I think Saudi Arabia really wants to be seen as a geopolitical player who is able to facilitate peace on Ukraine, on the Middle East, on perhaps a deal with Iran and the United States. So, yes, I think Saudi Arabia is definitely enjoying taking on this role as mediator, an important and sort of more neutral place for meetings on this kind of a level to take place between Russia and the United States.
Mohammed bin Salman, of course, hosting the US and Russia today. Mari, in Paris, massive day for the Prime Minister.
Yeah, huge. Big summit in Paris, lots of European leaders. PM says he's there to tell people to spend more on defence and to be a bridge between the US and Europe.
Lots more of that throughout the day here on Sky News. Up next, it's Sky News Today. Don't go anywhere after this short break.